Emily Turner stood at the entrance of Rocky Mountain National Park, her heart racing with excitement. The 29-year-old nurse from Denver had been planning this solo hiking trip for months, eager to escape the bustle of city life and immerse herself in nature. As she stepped out of her car, the crisp mountain air filled her lungs, carrying with it the scent of pine and wild flowers. She shouldered her backpack, filled with carefully packed supplies for the weekend ahead. The weight felt reassuring, a reminder of her preparedness for the adventure to come. Emily's hiking boots crunched on the gravel as she made her way to the visitor center, a rustic wooden building that seemed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. As she pushed open the heavy door, a small bell chimed, announcing her arrival. The interior was warm and inviting, with large windows offering panoramic views of the snow-capped peaks in the distance. Maps and informational posters adorned the walls, showcasing the park's diverse wildlife and terrain. A friendly-looking park ranger greeted her from behind the counter. His name tag read Mike, and his weathered face spoke of years spent in the great outdoors. "Welcome to Rocky Mountain National Park," Mike said with a warm smile. "How can I help you today?" Emily approached the counter, her excitement evident in her voice. "Hi, I'm here for a weekend hiking trip. I was hoping to get some information on the best trails and maybe a map of the area." Mike nodded approvingly. "Solo hiker, huh? Always good to see folks getting out there and exploring. Let me get you set up with everything you need." As Mike rummaged through a drawer, pulling out various maps and brochures, Emily's eyes wandered to a poster on the wall. It depicted a large black bear standing on its hind legs, with bold letters warning visitors about bear safety. Mike noticed her gaze and chuckled. "Ah, I see you've spotted our local celebrities. We've got quite a few black bears in the park. Don't worry, though. They're usually more scared of us than we are of them." Emily's eyes widened slightly. "I've never encountered a bear before. Should I be concerned?" Mike laid out a detailed topographical map on the counter. "Not if you follow proper precautions. Here, let me give you our bear safety pamphlet. It's got all the do's and don'ts for hiking in bear country." He handed her a colorful trifold brochure. Emily skimmed it quickly, taking in the bold headlines. "Store food properly, make noise while hiking, and what to do if you encounter a bear." "Thanks," Emily said, tucking the pamphlet into her pocket. "I'll make sure to read it thoroughly." Mike pointed to the map spread out before them. "Now for your hike. Given that you're here for the weekend, I'd recommend this trail here." His finger traced a winding path through the contour lines. "It's a bit less traveled than some of our more popular routes, but the views are absolutely spectacular." Emily leaned in, studying the route. "It looks perfect. How challenging is it?" "Moderate to difficult in some spots," Mike replied, "but nothing a prepared hiker can't handle. You'll want to make sure you've got plenty of water, some high-energy snacks, and a good first aid kit. Oh, and don't forget your bear spray, just in case." Emily nodded, mentally checking off each item. She'd packed all the essentials, including a small canister of bear spray, though she hoped she wouldn't need to use it. "One more thing," Mike added, his tone becoming more serious. "Make sure to let someone know your planned route and expected return time. It's always good to have a check-in buddy when you're hiking solo." "Already done," Emily assured him. "My roommate has all the details. She'll alert the rangers if I don't check in by Sunday evening." Mike smiled, clearly impressed by her preparedness. "Sounds like you've got it all covered. Any other questions before you head out?" Emily thought for a moment, then shook her head. "I think I'm all set. Thanks for all your help, Mike." "My pleasure," he replied, handing her the map. "Enjoy your hike, and remember, respect the wildlife, leave no trace, and soak in all the beauty this park has to offer." As Emily turned to leave, Mike called out one last piece of advice. "Oh, and if you do see a bear, remember, you're in their home. Give them space and they'll usually leave you alone." With a final wave, Emily stepped back out into the sunshine. She paused for a moment, taking in the majestic view of the mountains before her. The enormity of the landscape made her feel small, but also filled her with a sense of awe and anticipation. She double-checked her backpack, ensuring everything was secure. The bear spray was easily accessible in a side pocket, though she sincerely hoped it would remain unused throughout her trip. With a deep breath, she set off towards the trailhead, her boots soon finding the well-worn path that would lead her into the heart of the wilderness. As she hiked, The visitor center and parking lot quickly disappeared from view, replaced by towering pines and rugged terrain. The trail wound its way upward, offering increasingly breathtaking vistas with each switchback. Emily paused occasionally to catch her breath and snap photos with her smartphone, careful to stay aware of her surroundings as Mike had advised. The afternoon wore on, and Emily found herself completely immersed in the natural world around her. The worries and stresses of her life in Denver seemed to melt away with each step. She spotted a pair of mule deer grazing in a meadow and watched in awe as a golden eagle soared overhead. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Emily consulted her map and the lengthening shadows. She had made good progress and was nearing the area where she planned to make camp for the night. The thought of sitting by a small campfire, gazing up at the stars, filled her with contentment. Just as she was about to round a bend in the trail, a movement in the underbrush caught her. Emily froze, her heart suddenly pounding. Was it a bear? She held her breath, waiting to see if anything would emerge. After a tense moment, a small red fox trotted out onto the path. It regarded Emily with curious eyes before disappearing back into the forest as quickly as it had appeared. Emily let out a relieved laugh, shaking her head at her own jumpiness. "Get it together, Em," she muttered to herself. "Not every rustle in the bushes is a bear out to get you." Still, the encounter served as a reminder of Mike's warnings. As Emily continued her hike, she began to sing softly to herself, letting any wildlife in the area know of her presence. The sound of her voice carried on the mountain breeze was a solitary melody in the vast wilderness, a single human note in nature's grand symphony. As the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Emily arrived at the designated camping area. She efficiently set up her tent, her movements practiced from previous camping trips. Following the instructions from the bear safety pamphlet, she carefully hung her food supplies and scented items from a tree branch, a good distance from her campsite. Sitting by her small controlled campfire, Emily reflected on the day's journey. The forest around her was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures awakening. As she sipped hot tea from her thermal mug, a sense of peace washed over her. This was why she had come, to reconnect with nature, to challenge herself, and to find a moment of tranquility in her busy life. Little did Emily know that her peaceful solo adventure was about to take a turn she could never have anticipated. As she drifted off to sleep in her tent that night, the vast, wild expanse of Rocky Mountain National Park held both beauty and danger, and somewhere in the darkness, a black bear roamed, its path destined to intersect with her own. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Emily's campsite as she emerged from her tent, stretching her arms wide and breathing in the crisp mountain air. The events of the previous day, her arrival at Rocky Mountain National Park, the informative chat with Ranger Mike, and her initial hike had set the stage for what promised to be an exhilarating day of exploration. After a quick breakfast of granola and dried fruit, Emily packed up her campsite, making sure to leave no trace of her overnight stay. She double-checked her map, tracing the route she planned to take for the day. The trail ahead was less traveled, just as Mike had mentioned, and Emily felt a thrill of anticipation at the thought of venturing into the park's more secluded areas. As she set off, the forest around her came alive with the sounds of the new day. Birds called to one another from the treetops, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush hinted at small animals going about their morning routines. Emily found herself smiling, feeling perfectly at peace in this natural setting. The trail gradually inclined, leading her higher into the mountains. Emily's muscles warmed up quickly, and she fell into a steady rhythm, her hiking poles clicking against the rocky path. Every so often, she paused to take in the breathtaking views that unfolded around her. Vast expanses of pine forest stretched out below, while jagged peaks loomed in the distance, their snow-capped summits seeming to touch the azure sky. "Wow," Emily breathed, pulling out her phone to snap a photo. "This is absolutely incredible." As she continued her ascent, the vegetation began to change. The dense forest thinned out, giving way to hardy alpine plants that clung tenaciously to the rocky soil. Emily found herself above the tree line, where the vistas became even more spectacular. She decided it was time for a short break and found a flat rock to sit on, pulling out her water bottle and a protein bar. While she rested, Emily noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. Turning slowly, she saw a small group of bighorn sheep picking their way across a nearby slope. Their sure-footed grace as they navigated the steep terrain was mesmerizing. Emily watched them for several minutes, enthralled by the sight. "You guys make this look so easy," she murmured, chuckling to herself. Feeling rejuvenated, Emily shouldered her pack and continued on her way. The trail now wound along a ridgeline, offering panoramic views in all directions. She found herself constantly pausing to take photos, trying to capture the majesty of the landscape, though she knew her smartphone camera could never do it full justice. As the day wore on, Emily encountered a few other hikers, exchanging brief greetings and trail information. An older couple, Bob and Linda, stopped to chat with her for a few minutes. "First time in the Rockies?" Bob asked, his weathered face creasing into a friendly smile. Emily nodded. "Yes, and it's even more beautiful than I imagined." Linda beamed at her enthusiasm. "Oh, honey, you picked a great time to visit. The wildflowers should be blooming in the meadows just ahead. It's a sight you won't forget." Thanking them for the tip, Emily continued on her way, her anticipation building. Sure enough, as she rounded a bend in the trail, she found herself facing a spectacular alpine meadow. True to Linda's words, it was awash with color: delicate mountain bluebells, vibrant Indian paintbrush, and cheery yellow sunflowers nodded in the gentle breeze. Emily stood for a moment, simply drinking in the scene. Then, careful not to trample any of the delicate plants, she made her way to the center of the meadow. Finding a clear spot, she sat down, pulled out her journal, and began to sketch the flowers around her. While she was no artist, Emily found the act of drawing helped her notice details she might otherwise miss: the intricate patterns on a petal, the way the stems bent in the wind. As she sat there, surrounded by nature's beauty, Emily felt a profound sense of contentment. This was exactly what she had hoped for when planning this solo trip: a chance to disconnect from the hectic pace of her life in Denver and reconnect with the natural world. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky when Emily reluctantly packed up her journal and continued on her way. The trail now began to descend, leading her back into the shelter of the forest. The change in environment was palpable. The air grew cooler, and the sounds of the woodland replaced the open quietness of the alpine zone. As she hiked, Emily's thoughts turned to the wildlife she might encounter. She had seen plenty of smaller animals and birds throughout the day, but part of her hoped for a glimpse of some of the park's larger residents, perhaps an elk or a moose. And then, unbidden, the image of the bear from the safety pamphlet flashed in her mind. Emily shook her head, chuckling at herself. "Come on, Turner," she said aloud, her voice sounding oddly loud in the quiet forest. "What are the chances of actually seeing a bear?" Still, she found herself scanning the woods more carefully as she walked, and she began to sing softly to herself, a habit she'd picked up on previous hikes to alert any nearby animals of her presence. As the day's light began to fade, Emily started looking for a suitable campsite. She wanted to find a spot before it got too dark, remembering Mike's advice about proper camp setup. After a bit of searching, she found a small clearing that seemed perfect: flat ground for her tent, a nearby stream for water, and plenty of trees for hanging her food. Emily efficiently set up her camp, her movements practiced and sure. She pitched her tent, gathered water from the stream using her purification tablets, and prepared a simple dinner of dehydrated camping food. As she ate, she watched the forest around her transform in the fading light. Shadows lengthened, and the sounds changed as diurnal creatures settled down for the night and nocturnal ones began to stir. Following proper bear safety protocols, Emily carefully packed away all her food and scented items, hanging them from a high branch a good distance from her tent. She double-checked that nothing smelly remained in her tent or backpack. As night fell in earnest, Emily sat outside her tent, gazing up at the star-filled sky. Away from the light pollution of the city, the Milky Way was clearly visible, a river of stars stretching across the heavens. The day's hike had left her pleasantly tired, and she found herself yawning. Before turning in for the night, Emily took out her phone and sent a quick text to her roommate back in Denver, letting her know she was safe and having a great time. Signal was spotty in the park, but the message seemed to go through. Crawling into her sleeping bag, Emily fell asleep almost immediately, lulled by the gentle sounds of the forest at night. Her last thoughts were of the day's adventures and the exciting hike that awaited her tomorrow. Little did she know that the peaceful night would not last, and that her encounter with the wild was about to become far more intense than she had ever imagined. As Emily slept soundly in her tent, the forest outside stirred with unseen movement, and somewhere in the darkness, a hungry black bear caught the faint scent of human presence on the breeze. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink, Emily Turner surveyed her surroundings with a keen eye. She had hiked for most of the day, covering a significant distance on the lesser-known trail recommended by Ranger Mike. Now, with evening approaching, it was time to set up camp for the night. Emily found a small clearing that seemed ideal for camping. It was nestled between a stand of tall pines and a babbling brook, offering both shelter and a water source. The ground was relatively flat, perfect for pitching her tent. She took a moment to appreciate the tranquil beauty of the spot before getting to work. "All right, home sweet home for the night," Emily murmured to herself as she shrugged off her backpack. She rolled her shoulders, working out the kinks from a long day of hiking. The cool mountain air felt refreshing on her skin, carrying the scent of pine and wild herbs. With practiced efficiency, Emily began to set up her campsite. She had done this many times before, but never alone in bear country. The thought made her slightly nervous, but she pushed it aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. First, she cleared a small area of any rocks or sticks, creating a smooth surface for her tent. As she worked, she hummed softly to herself, the sound mingling with the gentle rustle of leaves and the gurgling of the nearby stream. "Tent check," Emily said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. The small two-person tent stood sturdy and secure, its forest green color blending seamlessly with the surrounding foliage. Next, she turned her attention to her food supplies. This was the crucial part. Proper food storage was essential in bear country. Emily recalled the bear safety pamphlet she had received at the visitor center and Ranger Mike's words of caution. "Okay, Emily, remember the rules," she said aloud, her voice steady and determined. "No food in the tent, no scented items. Hang everything at least 100 feet away." She gathered all her food, along with her toiletries and anything else that might have an enticing scent, into a stuff sack. Then she began searching for a suitable tree to hang her bear bag. It took some time, but Emily finally found the perfect branch. It was about 20 feet high, extended well away from the trunk, and looked strong enough to support her food bag. She tied a small rock to one end of her rope and, after a few attempts, managed to toss it over the branch. "Yes," she exclaimed, pumping her fist in a small victory celebration. "Who needs baseball when you've got bear bag hanging skills?" Carefully, she hoisted her food bag up, making sure it was at least 10 feet off the ground and 4 feet from the trunk of the tree. She secured the rope tightly, double-checking that everything was well out of reach of any curious bears. With her campsite set up and her food properly stored, Emily allowed herself to relax a bit. She collected some water from the stream, using her portable filter to purify it, and began preparing her dinner. As she waited for her dehydrated camping meal to rehydrate, she sat on a fallen log, taking in the peacefulness of her surroundings. The forest was alive with the sounds of evening. Birds called to one another as they settled in for the night, and insects began their nightly chorus. In the distance, she heard the haunting call of a loon, the sound echoing across the landscape. As she ate her simple meal, Emily reflected on the day's hike. She had seen so much beauty. The sweeping vistas from the ridgelines, the colorful wildflowers in the alpine meadows, the graceful bighorn sheep navigating impossibly steep slopes. It had been everything she had hoped for when planning this solo adventure. After dinner, Emily dutifully cleaned her cooking utensils, making sure to disperse the wastewater well away from her campsite. She was meticulous in ensuring that no food smells lingered near her tent. As darkness fell, Emily sat outside her tent, gazing up at the star-filled sky. Away from the light pollution of the city, the night sky was a spectacular sight. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens, and countless stars twinkled brightly. "Wow," she breathed, awestruck by the celestial display. "You certainly don't see this in Denver." She pulled out her journal and jotted down some notes about the day, sketching a quick drawing of the night sky. Emily had always found that journaling helped her remember the details of her adventures better. As she wrote, a cool breeze rustled through the trees, causing the branches to sway gently. The sound was soothing, but it also served as a reminder that she was alone in the wilderness. Emily zipped up her jacket, suddenly aware of the dropping temperature. "Time to turn in, I think," she said to herself, stifling a yawn, before crawling into her tent. Emily took one last look around her campsite. Her food bag hung securely in the distance. Her campsite was clean, with no attractive smells to lure in wildlife. She had followed all the proper procedures. "Not bad, Turner," she murmured, nodding with satisfaction. "Bear-proof camping achieved." Inside her tent, Emily changed into her sleeping clothes and snuggled into her sleeping bag. The sounds of the forest surrounded her, the gentle rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft babbling of the stream. It was a soothing lullaby, so different from the urban noise she was used to in Denver. As she lay there, Emily's mind wandered to the possibility of encountering a bear. Despite her precautions, a small kernel of anxiety lingered in the pit of her stomach. What if a bear did come into her campsite during the night? "Stop it," she chided herself softly. "You've done everything right. The chances of a bear bothering you are slim to none." To distract herself, Emily began planning the next day's hike in her mind. There was a beautiful lake about 5 miles up the trail that she was eager to see. She imagined herself sitting by its shore, perhaps even taking a quick, refreshing dip if the weather was warm enough. Gradually, lulled by the peaceful sounds of the forest and tired from the day's exertions, Emily drifted off to sleep. Her breathing deepened and slowed, matching the rhythm of the wilderness around her. Outside, the forest continued its nightly activities. Small creatures scurried about in the underbrush. Nocturnal birds called softly to one another. And somewhere, not too far away, a black bear emerged from the depths of the forest, its nose twitching as it caught the faint scent of something interesting on the breeze. Unaware of the approaching danger, Emily slept on, her dreams filled with the beautiful sights she had witnessed during the day. The peaceful night enveloped her campsite, but the tranquility was deceptive. In the wild, danger could arrive swiftly and unexpectedly, and Emily's solo adventure was about to take a turn she could never have anticipated. The night was still, save for the gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional hoot of a distant owl. Emily slept soundly in her tent, her breathing deep and rhythmic, lulled by the peaceful sounds of the forest. The events of the day, the exhilarating hike, the breathtaking views and the meticulous camp setup had left her pleasantly exhausted. It was in the darkest hours of the night, long after Emily had drifted off to sleep, that the first signs of disturbance broke the tranquility. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness, followed by the soft sound of heavy paws padding on the forest floor. These subtle noises, barely audible over the ambient sounds of the night, were not enough to rouse the sleeping hiker. The black bear, a young male about 3 years old, had picked up the scent of human presence earlier in the evening. Curious and driven by an insatiable appetite, typical of bears preparing for hibernation, it had slowly made its way towards Emily's campsite. Its nose twitched constantly, sampling the air for any hint of food. As the bear lumbered into the small clearing where Emily's tent stood, moonlight filtered through the canopy, illuminating its shaggy form. Standing at about 5 feet tall on all fours, the bear was an impressive sight, though Emily, still fast asleep, remained blissfully unaware of its presence. The bear's attention was immediately drawn to Emily's backpack, which she had left, leaning against a tree near her tent. While she had been diligent about hanging her food supply and scented items from a distant tree, she had forgotten about the granola bar wrapper stuffed hastily into an outer pocket of her pack earlier that day. With surprising delicacy for such a large creature, the bear began to investigate the backpack. Its claws, more accustomed to digging for grubs or stripping bark from trees, made a soft scraping sound against the nylon material. Inside the tent, Emily stirred slightly. Some primal part of her brain, attuned to potential danger even in sleep, began to register that something was amiss. Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't fully wake. The bear, growing frustrated with its inability to easily access the scent that had attracted it, became more aggressive in its exploration. It knocked the backpack over, the sound of metal carabiners clanking against rocks cutting sharply through the night air. This noise was enough to finally jolt Emily from her slumber. Her eyes snapped open, heart immediately racing as her mind struggled to make sense of the sounds coming from just outside her tent. "What the?" she mumbled, still groggy from sleep. As her mind cleared, the realization of what might be happening sent a jolt of adrenaline through her system. Emily lay, perfectly still, straining her ears. The sounds of something large moving around her campsite were unmistakable now. The scraping of claws, the heavy breathing, the rustling of her gear, it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. "Oh God," she whispered, her voice barely audible, even to herself. "It's a bear." Her mind raced, trying to remember everything she had learned about bear encounters. Stay calm, make noise, make yourself look big. But all of that advice seemed to evaporate in the face of actual danger. The bear, having thoroughly investigated the backpack without finding the food it was seeking, began to explore the rest of the campsite. Its powerful sense of smell led it inevitably towards Emily's tent. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she heard the bear's footsteps approaching. She could see its shadow through the thin fabric of the tent, illuminated by the moonlight. The bear was huge, far larger than she had imagined it would be. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but Emily forced herself to take deep, quiet breaths. She knew that her best chance was to remain calm and avoid provoking the bear. The bear snuffled at the tent, its hot breath visible as small clouds of condensation on the tent wall. Emily lay frozen, hardly daring to breathe. She could hear the bear's claws brushing against the fabric, mere inches from her face. "Please go away," she thought desperately, squeezing her eyes shut. "Please, please go away." But the bear, driven by curiosity and the lingering scent of the granola bar wrapper, was not so easily dissuaded. It began to push against the tent, the thin nylon offering little resistance against its bulk. Emily realized with horror that the bear was about to collapse her tent. In that moment, her paralysis broke, and survival instinct took over. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. "Get out of here!" The sudden noise startled the bear, causing it to rear up on its hind legs. The movement drove one of its paws through the tent fabric, tearing a large hole. "Emily!" screamed, a sound of pure terror that echoed through the trees. She scrambled to unzip her sleeping bag, her fingers fumbling with the zipper in her panic. The bear, momentarily taken aback by the noise and sudden movement, took a step back. But it didn't flee. Instead, it seemed to grow more agitated, huffing and swaying on its feet. Emily managed to free herself from her sleeping bag and crawled towards the far side of the tent, as far from the bear as she could get. Her mind raced, trying to remember where she had put her bear spray. Was it in the tent with her or in her backpack outside? "Okay, Emily, think," she muttered to herself, trying to steady her nerves. "What did the pamphlet say? What did Mike tell you?" The bear, seemingly emboldened by Emily's movement, began to investigate the tent again. It pushed its head through the hole it had created, its black eyes glinting in the moonlight as it looked directly at Emily. In that moment, face to face with a wild bear, Emily felt a surge of determination cut through her fear. She knew she had to act, or she might not survive this encounter. With as much force as she could muster, she yelled, "Go away!" Her voice was strong and commanding, despite the fear that made her hands shake. The bear hesitated, clearly not expecting such a forceful response from its potential prey. It huffed again, steam rising from its nostrils in the cool night air. Emily continued to shout, her voice growing louder and more insistent. "Get out of here! Go on, get!" She began to clap her hands together loudly, creating as much noise as possible. The bear, confused and somewhat intimidated by this noisy, seemingly fearless creature, took a step back from the tent. Seizing the moment, Emily crawled towards the tent opening, never taking her eyes off the bear. Her hand brushed against something solid, her water bottle. Without thinking, she grabbed it. As she emerged from the tent, she found herself face to face with the bear. It was even larger up close, its muscles rippling beneath its thick fur as it swayed uncertainly on its feet. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood her ground. Remembering the advice from her safety pamphlet, she raised her arms, trying to make herself look as large as possible. "I'm not afraid of you," she shouted, though her quavering voice betrayed her true feelings. She waved her arms and continued to yell, creating as much commotion as she could. The bear, faced with this loud, aggressive creature, began to show signs of uncertainty. It took another step back, then another. Sensing that her strategy was working, Emily pressed her advantage. She hurled her water bottle at the bear, the metal canteen clanging loudly as it hit a nearby rock. This was the final straw for the bear. With a huff that sounded almost indignant, it turned and lumbered back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had arrived. Emily stood there, breathing heavily, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. She listened, intently, trying to hear if the bear was truly gone or if it was coming back. But the forest had returned to its normal nighttime quiet, with only the soft hooting of an owl breaking the silence. As the adrenaline began to ebb, the reality of what had just happened hit Emily like a tidal wave. She sank to her knees, her whole body trembling. "Oh my God," she whispered, tears beginning to stream down her face. "Oh my God." She had just faced one of her greatest fears, and survived. But as she looked at her torn tent and scattered gear, Emily knew that her ordeal was far from over. The night was still dark. The bear could return, and she was alone in the wilderness, miles from help. With shaking hands, Emily reached for her backpack, searching for her bear spray and flashlight. She knew she wouldn't be sleeping again tonight. All she could do now was wait for dawn, stay alert, and hope that the bear didn't decide to come back for a second visit. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she sat with her back against a tree, her eyes scanning the darkness surrounding her campsite. The encounter with the black bear had left her shaken to her core, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She clutched her bear spray tightly, the canister cool against her sweaty palms. As the initial shock began to wear off, Emily's mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. The bear's sudden appearance, the terrifying moments inside the tent, and her instinctive reaction to fight back all played on repeat in her head. "Okay, Emily, think," she muttered to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's the next move?" She glanced at her watch. It was just past 2 a.m. Dawn was still hours away, and the thought of spending the rest of the night in this vulnerable state made her stomach churn. Emily knew she needed to reassess her situation and come up with a plan. First things first, she needed to secure her campsite as best she could. With shaky legs, Emily stood up, keeping her bear spray at the ready. She fumbled for her headlamp in her backpack and switched it on, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The sight of her ravaged campsite made her breath catch. Her tent lay in tatters, the nylon fabric torn where the bear had pushed through. Her backpack was knocked over, its contents spilled across the forest floor. It was a stark reminder of how close she had come to disaster. Emily began to gather her scattered belongings, constantly looking over her shoulder and straining her ears for any sign of the bear's return. As she picked up her backpack, she noticed the granola bar wrapper sticking out of the side pocket. "Oh no," she groaned, realization dawning. "I can't believe I forgot about this. Stupid, stupid mistake." The wrapper served as a harsh reminder of how even small oversights could lead to dangerous situations in the wilderness. Emily made a mental note to be more vigilant in the future, assuming she made it out of this ordeal. With her gear collected, Emily faced a difficult decision. Her tent was no longer usable, leaving her without shelter. The thought of spending the rest of the night out in the open, exposed to both the elements and potentially returning wildlife, was not appealing. "I could try to hike out," she mused, aloud weighing her options. But navigating these trails in the dark would be risky. After a moment's consideration, Emily decided that staying put until daylight was her safest bet. She would remain vigilant and be ready to act if the bear returned. To give herself some sense of security, Emily gathered some nearby rocks and branches, creating a small perimeter around herself. It was more psychological comfort than actual protection, but it helped calm her nerves slightly. As she worked, Emily tried to recall everything she knew about bear behavior. "They're usually more afraid of us than we are of them," she recited, remembering Ranger Mike's words. "But this one seemed pretty bold. Maybe it's used to human food." The thought made her shudder. A bear accustomed to human food could be more persistent and dangerous. Emily silently berated herself again for the granola bar wrapper mishap. With her makeshift camp set up, Emily settled in for a long night. She sat with her back against a large tree, bear spray in one hand, and her hiking poles within easy reach. Her headlamp remained on, its beam sweeping the forest periodically. The hours crawled by agonizingly slowly. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves sent Emily's heart racing, her grip tightening on the bear spray. But as time passed and the bear didn't return, she began to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe the worst was over. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, Emily let out a long, shaky breath. She had made it through the night. The forest around her came alive with the sounds of birds greeting the new day, a stark contrast to the tense silence of the night. Emily stood up, stretching her stiff muscles. The lack of sleep and constant state of alertness had taken their toll, and she felt utterly exhausted. But there was no time to rest. She needed to pack up and get moving. As she began to gather her belongings, Emily took stock of her situation. Her tent was unusable, and she had used up a good portion of her food and water during the long night. The smart move would be to cut her trip short and head back to civilization. "So much for my solo wilderness adventure," she said ruefully, stuffing her torn tent into her backpack. With everything packed, Emily pulled out her map and compass. She traced the route back to the trailhead, estimating it would take most of the day to hike out. It was disappointing to end her trip early, but after the night's events, Emily was more than ready to return to safety. As she shouldered her backpack and took one last look around the campsite, Emily felt a mix of emotions wash over her. Fear and relief were prominent, but there was also a sense of pride. She had faced one of her worst fears and come out the other side. "I guess I'm tougher than I thought," she mused, a small smile playing on her lips. With a deep breath, Emily set off down the trail. Her senses were on high alert, every sound and movement in the forest catching her attention. But as she hiked, putting distance between herself and the site of the bear encounter, she began to feel her confidence returning. The morning sun filtered through the trees, warming her face and lifting her spirits. Emily found herself appreciating the beauty of the forest in a new way, the vibrant greens of the leaves, the melodic songs of the birds, the fresh scent of pine. It all seemed more vivid after her harrowing night. As she hiked, Emily's mind wandered to how she would tell this story to her friends and family back home. Would they believe her? Would they think she was exaggerating? She could almost hear her roommate's voice. "Only you, Emily, could go on a relaxing hiking trip and end up fighting off a bear." The thought made her chuckle, the sound of her own laughter strange in the quiet forest. It felt good to laugh, to release some of the tension that had built up over the night. By midday, Emily had covered a significant distance. She paused in a small clearing to rest and have a quick lunch. As she sat on a fallen log munching on her last energy bar, she reflected on the events of the past 24 hours. "What a wild ride," she said to herself, shaking her head in disbelief. Despite the fear and danger, Emily realized that this experience had taught her valuable lessons. She had learned the hard way about the importance of proper food storage and campsite cleanliness. She had discovered reserves of courage and quick thinking she didn't know she possessed, and she had gained a deeper respect for the wilderness and its inhabitants. As Emily packed up her lunch and prepared to continue her hike, she made a promise to herself. This experience, frightening as it was, wouldn't deter her from future adventures. Instead, it would serve as a reminder to always be prepared, to respect nature, and to trust in her own abilities. With renewed determination, Emily set off down the trail again. The trailhead and safety was still several hours away, but she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. After all, she had stared down a bear and lived to tell the tale. What could be scarier than that? Emily's muscles ached as she pushed on through the forest, her mind replaying the terrifying encounter with the black bear over and over. The adrenaline that had kept her alert through the night was wearing off, leaving her exhausted but still too wired to relax. Every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush made her flinch, her hand instinctively tightening on the bear spray canister. As she rounded a bend in the trail, Emily froze. There, not 30 feet ahead of her, stood the black bear. Its dark, eyes locked onto her, and for a moment time seemed to stand still. "Oh no," Emily whispered, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Not again. The bear, perhaps the same one from her campsite, or maybe a different individual, regarded her with what seemed like curiosity. It was bigger than she had realized in the darkness of night, its shoulders hunched and powerful. Emily's mind raced, trying to remember everything she had learned about bear encounters. "Stay calm," she muttered to herself. "Make yourself look big, don't run." Slowly, deliberately, Emily raised her arms above her head, trying to make herself appear as large as possible. Her voice shook as she called out, "Hey bear, I see you. Go away." The bear, startled by her sudden movement and noise, took a step back, but it didn't flee. Instead, it seemed to consider her, its nose twitching as it caught her scent on the breeze. Emily's legs trembled, but she stood her ground. She remembered reading that bears often bluff charge to test their opponents. "Don't be prey," she told herself firmly. "Stand your ground." As if reading her thoughts, the bear suddenly reared up on its hind legs, letting out a deep, rumbling growl. Emily's resolve nearly crumbled at the sight of the creature towering over her, but she forced herself to stay put. "Go away," she shouted, her voice stronger now, fueled by a surge of desperate courage. She clapped her hands together loudly, the sharp sound echoing through the trees. The bear dropped back to all fours, seeming uncertain. It took a step towards Emily, then paused, as if weighing its options. Emily's hand tightened on the bear spray. She knew she should use it if the bear came any closer, but a part of her hesitated. What if she missed? What if it only made the bear angrier? In that moment of indecision, the bear made its move. With surprising speed for such a large animal, it charged towards Emily. Time seemed to slow down. Emily saw the bear's muscles bunching under its shaggy coat, its paws pounding the earth, its eyes fixed on her. In that split second, all her training and preparation fled her mind. Pure instinct took over. Emily turned and ran. She knew it was the wrong thing to do. Every piece of bear safety advice warned against running. But faced with hundreds of pounds of charging predator, her body made the decision for her. She crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at her face and arms. She could hear the bear behind her, its heavy breathing and the thud of its paws spurring her on. "Help!" she screamed, though she knew there was no one around to hear. "Somebody help me!" In her panic, Emily lost her footing on the uneven ground. She stumbled, her ankle twisting painfully as she fell. She hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her. Gasping for breath, Emily rolled over, expecting to see the bear looming over her. Instead, she saw it standing a few yards away, watching her with what almost looked like confusion. It was then that Emily realized the bear hadn't been trying to attack her at all. It had been a bluff charge, just as she had read about. By running, she had triggered its chase instinct. As she lay there, panting and trembling, the bear took a tentative step towards her. Emily's hand scrambled in the dirt, searching for something, anything she could use to defend herself. Her fingers closed around her water bottle, which had fallen from her backpack during the fall. Without thinking, Emily grabbed it and hurled it at the bear with all her might. The metal bottle struck the bear squarely on the nose. It let out a startled huff, shaking its head in surprise and pain. That moment of confusion was all Emily needed. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the sharp pain in her ankle, and raised her arms high. "Get out of here," she roared, her voice raw with fear and determination. She clapped her hands together, creating as much noise as she could. The bear, already rattled by the water bottle to the nose, took a step back. Emily pressed her advantage, continuing to shout and make herself look as big and intimidating as possible. Finally, with one last huff that sounded almost indignant, the bear turned and lumbered off into the forest. Emily stood there, breathing heavily, her whole body shaking. She listened intently, trying to hear if the bear was truly gone or if it was circling back. But the forest had returned to its normal sounds, with only the occasional bird call breaking the silence. As the adrenaline began to ebb, Emily became aware of a sharp pain in her left arm. Looking down, she saw a long gash running from her elbow to her wrist, likely from a branch she had struck during her panicked flight. Blood trickled from the wound, and now that she was aware of it, it began to throb painfully. "Oh God," she muttered, the reality of what had just happened crashing over her. She sank to her knees, her legs no longer able to support her. With trembling hands, Emily reached for her first aid kit. She cleaned the wound as best she could with an antiseptic wipe, hissing at the sting. The cut wasn't too deep, but it was long and ragged. She wrapped it with gauze, her medical training kicking in despite her shock. As she tended to her injury, Emily's mind raced. She was injured, alone, and still miles from the trailhead. The bear could still be nearby, and now with her supplies scattered during her fall, she wasn't sure how much water or food she had left. "Get it together, Emily," she said aloud, her voice shaky but determined. "You've got to keep moving." She gathered what she could find of her scattered gear, wincing as she put weight on her twisted ankle. It wasn't broken, but it would definitely slow her down. With a deep breath, Emily looked in the direction the bear had disappeared. Then she turned and began limping down the trail in the opposite direction. She knew she had a long, difficult journey ahead of her, but she had survived not one but 2 bear encounters. She was tougher than she had ever given herself credit for. As she hiked, favoring her injured ankle and cradling her bandaged arm, Emily found herself hyper-aware of her surroundings. Every sound, every movement in the forest caught her attention, but mixed with the fear was a new feeling, a sense of respect for the wild and its inhabitants, and a growing confidence in her ability to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. Emily knew she needed to make it back to the trailhead before dark. With grim determination, she pressed on, each step bringing her closer to safety and further from the most harrowing experience of her life. The sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows through the forest as Emily limped along the trail. Her left arm throbbed beneath its makeshift bandage, and each step sent a jolt of pain through her twisted ankle. But despite her injuries and exhaustion, she pressed on, driven by the urgent need to reach safety before nightfall. Emily's mind raced as she hobbled forward, replaying the terrifying encounter with the bear. She couldn't shake the image of its powerful form charging towards her, the sound of its huffing breath still echoing in her ears. The realization of how close she had come to serious injury, or worse, made her shudder. "Keep it together." "Emily," she muttered to herself, her voice hoarse from shouting, "one foot in front of the other, you can do this." As she walked, Emily took stock of her situation. Her backpack was lighter now, having lost some of its contents during her panicked flight from the bear. She reached for her water bottle, only to remember with a groan that she had thrown it at the bear. The thought of the metal canister bouncing off the bear's nose almost made her laugh despite the gravity of her situation. "Note to self," she said aloud, her words punctuated by labored breaths. "Next time, throw the bear spray, not the water." The humor helped, if only for a moment, to lift her spirits. But as she continued down the trail, the reality of her predicament settled back in. She was injured, low on supplies, and still miles from the trailhead. And somewhere out there, a bear, maybe even 2, was roaming the same forest. Emily paused for a moment, leaning against a tree to catch her breath. She closed her eyes, trying to center herself. The forest around her was alive with the sounds of early evening, birds calling to one another, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Under different circumstances, she might have found it peaceful. Now every sound made her tense, half expecting to see another bear emerge from the shadows. As she stood there, Emily's thoughts turned to the safety briefing she had received from Ranger Mike at the start of her trip. His words came back to her now, tinged with irony. "Remember," she could almost hear him saying, "black bears are usually more afraid of you than you are of them." "Yeah, right," Emily scoffed, opening her eyes and pushing herself off the tree. "Tell that to the one that just chased me down the trail." She resumed her limping pace, wincing with each step. The pain in her ankle was getting worse, and she worried about how much longer she could keep going. But the alternative, spending another night in the forest, was unthinkable. As Emily rounded a bend in the trail, she suddenly froze. There, not 20 feet ahead of her, was a clearing she recognized. It was the campsite where she had spent the previous night, where she had first encountered the bear. For a moment, Emily considered turning back. The thought of revisiting the scene of her terror made her heart race. But she knew this was the quickest way back to the trailhead. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to continue forward. As she entered the clearing, Emily was struck by how ordinary it looked in the fading daylight. Her shredded tent still lay where she had abandoned it, a stark reminder of the night's events. But otherwise, there was no sign of the chaos and fear she had experienced. Emily approached her ruined tent cautiously, her eyes scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of movement. She knew she should keep moving, but something made her pause. Kneeling down, she began to sift through the remnants of her gear. To her surprise, she found her emergency satellite phone still intact. In the panic of the bear's attack and her hasty departure that morning, she had completely forgotten about it. With trembling hands, she turned it on, praying that it still had battery life. The screen flickered to life, and Emily let out a sob of relief. She quickly dialed the emergency number she had been given at the start of her trip. After what felt like an eternity, a voice crackled through the speaker. "Rocky Mountain National Park Emergency Services. What's your situation?" Emily's. Words came out in a rush. "My name is Emily Turner. I'm on the backcountry trail about 8 miles from the eastern trailhead. I've been attacked by a bear, twice. I'm injured and I don't think I can make it back on my own." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the voice returned, calm and professional. "Understood, Emily. Are you in a safe location now? Is the bear still in the area?" Emily glanced around nervously. "I'm at my old campsite. I haven't seen the bear since the second attack, but I don't know where it is now." "Okay, Emily, listen carefully," the voice instructed. "We're dispatching a rescue team to your location right away. It's going to take them a few hours to reach you. In the meantime, I need you to find a secure location. If you can, climb a tree or find a high rock formation. Make noise periodically to scare away any wildlife, but try to conserve your energy." "Can you do that?" Emily nodded, then realized they couldn't see her. "Yes, I can do that." "Good," the voice continued. "Keep this phone on. We'll check in with you regularly until the rescue team reaches you. You're going to be okay, Emily." As the call ended, Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. Help was coming. She just had to hold on for a few more hours. With renewed determination, Emily scanned her surroundings. She spotted a large boulder at the edge of the clearing that looked climbable. Gritting her teeth against the pain in her ankle, she made her way over to it. Climbing proved to be a challenge with her injuries, but adrenaline and fear gave her strength. She scrambled up the rock face, her fingers finding purchase in small crevices. When she reached the top, she collapsed, breathing heavily. From her elevated position, Emily had a clear view of the surrounding forest. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. Under different circumstances, she might have found it beautiful. Now she watched anxiously as shadows lengthened, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and threatening. As darkness fell, Emily huddled on top of the boulder, her back pressed against a smaller rock for support. Every sound from the forest below made her flinch. Was that the snap of a twig under a bear's paw? The rustle of leaves as it approached? To keep herself calm and alert, Emily began to talk to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've got this, Em. You've survived 2 bear attacks. You can handle a few hours in the dark. The rescue team is coming. Just hang on." She repeated these words like a mantra, clinging to them as the night grew deeper. Periodically, she would shout or clap her hands, following the instructions to make noise. Each time she tensed, half expecting to hear an answering growl from the darkness. As the hours crawled by, Emily's thoughts turned to home. She thought of her apartment in Denver, of her job at the hospital, of her friends and family. How ordinary and safe those things seemed now. How desperately she longed for them. "When I get out of here," she promised herself, "I'm never taking a hot shower for granted again." The satellite phone rang, making her jump. It was the emergency services, checking in. Yes, she was still safe. No, she hadn't seen any sign of the bear. Yes, she was hanging in there. After the call, Emily felt a renewed sense of hope. She wasn't alone out here. Help was coming. All she had to do was stay strong for a little while longer. As she settled back against the rock, Emily's eyes remained fixed on the dark forest below. Somewhere out there, rescue was on its way. and somewhere out there a bear roamed, reminding her that in the wilderness she was not the top of the food chain. It was a humbling thought, one that would stay with her long after this night was over. With a mix of fear and determination, Emily prepared herself for the long wait ahead. The night was far from over, and she knew that every sound, every shadow, would test her resolve. But she had come this far, she would see it through to the end. The first light of dawn was just beginning to paint the sky when Emily heard the distant sound of voices calling her name. She jerked awake, realizing she had dozed off despite her best efforts to stay alert. Her body ached from the hours spent huddled on top of the boulder, and for a moment she wondered if she was dreaming. "Emily Turner, can you hear us?" The voice came again, louder this time. Emily's heart leaped. It wasn't a dream. The rescue team had finally arrived. "Here!" she shouted, her voice hoarse from the night's ordeal. "I'm over here!" She scrambled to her feet, wincing as her injured ankle protested the sudden movement. Waving her arms frantically, she called out again, "I'm on the boulder! Over here!" Within minutes she saw them. 3 figures in bright orange vests emerging from the tree line. Emily felt tears of relief spring to her eyes as the rescue team approached her position. "Ms. Turner." One of the rescuers, a tall woman with a kind face, called up to her. "I'm Sarah with Rocky Mountain Search and Rescue. Are you injured?" Emily nodded, suddenly overwhelmed now that help had arrived. "My ankle and my arm, a bear attacked me." Sarah turned to her colleagues. "Jeff, radio in that we've found her. Tony, let's get the first aid kit ready." As Jeff stepped away to make the call, Sarah looked back up at Emily. "Okay, Ms. Turner, we're going to help you down from there. Just take it slow and easy." With Sarah and Tony's assistance, Emily carefully made her way down the boulder. Her stiff muscles screamed in protest, and she had to bite back a cry of pain when her injured ankle touched the ground. Once she was safely down, the team guided her to a fallen log where she could sit while they assessed her injuries. "You've had quite an adventure," Tony said as he gently examined her bandaged arm. "Can you tell us what happened?" Emily recounted her ordeal, her voice shaking as she described the 2 bear encounters. Sarah and Tony exchanged glances as she spoke, their expressions a mix of concern and admiration. "You did well," Sarah said when Emily finished her story. "Not many people could have handled 2 bear encounters like that." Tony nodded in agreement as he rebandaged Emily's arm with fresh gauze. "Your first aid was good too. This cut isn't too deep, but we'll want to have it properly cleaned and stitched when we get you to the hospital." "Hospital?" Emily echoed, suddenly realizing she didn't know what came next. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Standard procedure after a wildlife attack. We need to make sure there's no risk of infection, and they'll want to check that ankle too. But first we need to get you out of here." Jeff rejoined the group, a satellite radio in hand. "Chopper's on its way. ETA 20 minutes. Emily's eyes widened. "A helicopter?" Sarah smiled. "Fastest way to get you to medical care. Plus, with that ankle, a hike out wouldn't be comfortable." As they waited for the helicopter, the team gave Emily water and some high-energy snacks. They kept up a steady stream of conversation, which Emily appreciated. It helped keep her mind off the lingering fear and pain. "So, what brought you out here alone?" Jeff asked as he kept an eye on the sky for the incoming chopper. Emily sighed. "I wanted to challenge myself, I guess. Prove that I could handle a solo backcountry trip." She gave a rueful laugh. "Looks like I bit off more than I could chew." "Hey, don't be too hard on yourself," Tony said. "You survived a bear attack, 2 of them. That's not something many people can say." Sarah nodded in agreement. "And you did a lot of things right. You had a satellite phone, you knew basic first aid, you made noise to scare the bear away. Those things probably saved your life." Emily felt a warmth in her chest at their words. She had been so focused on her mistakes, the forgotten granola, bar wrapper, running from the bear, that she hadn't considered what she'd done right. The conversation was interrupted by the distant thump of helicopter blades. Within minutes, a red and white rescue chopper appeared over the treetops, stirring up a whirlwind of leaves as it approached. "Okay, Emily." Sarah had to raise her voice over the noise of the approaching helicopter. "We're going to get you on board now. The flight crew will take good care of you." As the helicopter touched down in a nearby clearing, Emily felt a mix of emotions wash over her. Relief at being rescued, lingering fear from her ordeal, and a strange sense of regret at leaving her adventure unfinished. With Sarah and Tony's help, Emily limped towards the waiting helicopter. As they neared the aircraft, she suddenly stopped and turned back to look at the forest behind her. "What is it?" Sarah asked, concern evident in her voice. Emily shook her head, struggling to put her feelings into words. I came out here to challenge myself, to experience the wilderness. And I did, just not in the way I expected." She paused, then added softly, "I'm not sure if I'm more scared of the forest now, or if I respect it more." Sarah gave her an understanding smile. "That's a normal feeling after what you've been through. The wilderness can be dangerous, but it's also incredibly beautiful and valuable. Maybe when you're healed up, you can come back and finish your trip." "With a group next time, though," Emily nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe I will." As the flight medics helped her into the helicopter, Emily took one last look at the forest. Somewhere out there, the bear that had changed her life was going about its day, unaware of the impact it had had on her. The thought was both terrifying and oddly comforting. The helicopter lifted off, the forest falling away beneath them. As they soared over the treetops, Emily felt a sense of closure. Her solo adventure hadn't gone as planned, but she had survived. She had faced her fears, pushed her limits, and come out the other side with a story to tell. As the helicopter banked towards civilization, Emily leaned back in her seat, exhaustion finally overtaking her. She closed her eyes, the rhythmic thump of the rotors lulling her into a light doze. Her adventure in the wilderness was over, but she knew that in many ways her journey was just beginning. The steady beep of medical monitors filled the air as Emily Turner lay in her hospital bed, her left arm wrapped in fresh bandages and her ankle elevated on a pillow. The stark white walls and antiseptic smell of the hospital room were a stark contrast to the wild beauty of the Rocky Mountains she had left behind just hours ago. A gentle knock on the door roused Emily from her thoughts. "Come in," she called out, her voice still a bit hoarse from her ordeal. Dr. Samantha Chen, the emergency room physician who had been overseeing Emily's care since her arrival, entered the room with a warm smile. "How are you feeling, Emily?" she asked, picking up the chart at the foot of the bed. Emily managed a small smile in return. "Better, I think. Still sore, but the pain medication is helping." Dr. Chen nodded as she reviewed the chart. "That's good to hear. The antibiotics we've started you on should prevent any infection from setting in. Those bear claws can carry a lot of bacteria." At the mention of the bear, Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. The memory of those terrifying encounters was still fresh in her mind. Noticing Emily's reaction, Dr. Chen pulled up a chair beside the bed. "Do you feel up to talking about what happened? It might help to process the experience." Emily took a deep breath and nodded. She recounted her story once again, from the first bear encounter at her campsite to the harrowing chase through the forest. As she spoke, Dr. Chen listened attentively, her expression a mix of concern and admiration. "You showed remarkable presence of mind," Dr. Chen said when Emily finished. "Many people freeze up completely in situations like that. Your quick thinking probably saved your life." Emily looked down at her bandaged arm. "I still can't believe it happened. One minute I was enjoying a peaceful hike, and the next." Dr. Chen patted her hand gently. "It's normal to feel shaken up after an experience like this. We have a counselor on staff who specializes in trauma. Would you like to speak with them?" Emily considered for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I think that might be helpful, thank you." Just then, there was another knock at the door. A park ranger entered, his hat in his hands. "Ms. Turner, I'm Ranger Mike Johnson. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about your encounter, if you're feeling up to it." Emily recognized him as the ranger who had given her the safety briefing at the start of her trip. She nodded, gesturing for him to come in. Ranger Mike pulled up another chair. "First off, I'm glad to see you're okay. We were all pretty worried when we got the call about a bear attack." Emily managed a weak smile. "Thanks to your team's quick response. I don't know what I would have done if they hadn't arrived when they did." The ranger nodded, pulling out a notepad. "Can you walk me through what happened? Any details you can remember would be helpful. We need to file a report and decide if any action needs to be taken regarding the bear." Emily recounted her story once more, trying to remember every detail. She described the bear's size, its behavior, and the locations of both encounters. Ranger Mike listened intently, jotting down notes. "Based on your description, it sounds like you encountered a young male black bear," Ranger Mike said when she finished. "It's unusual for them to be so bold, but not unheard of. We'll increase patrols in that area and put up some additional warnings for hikers." Will you have to hunt the bear?" Emily asked hesitantly, surprised by her own concern for the animal that had terrified her so thoroughly. Ranger Mike shook his head. "Not based on this incident. The bear's behavior, while concerning, doesn't warrant that kind of response. We'll monitor the situation closely, though." Emily felt a mixture of relief and apprehension at this news. Part of her was glad the bear wouldn't be harmed, while another part worried about other hikers potentially facing similar dangers. "Is there anything else I can do?" Emily asked. "To help prevent this from happening to someone else, I mean." Ranger Mike smiled. "You're already doing it. Your report helps us better understand bear behavior and improve our safety protocols. And if you're willing, we'd love to have you speak to some of our hiking groups about your experience. First-hand accounts can be powerful tools for education." Emily nodded slowly. "I'd like that, I think, once I've had some time to process everything." As Ranger Mike stood to leave, he paused. "You know, Ms. Turner, a lot of people would swear off the wilderness entirely after an experience like yours. The fact that you're already thinking about how to help others speaks volumes about your character." After the ranger left, Emily leaned back in her bed, feeling drained but somehow lighter. Talking through her experience, while difficult, had helped make it feel more real and less like a nightmare. A few minutes later, a nurse entered with a tray of food. As Emily picked at her hospital meal, her phone buzzed with incoming messages. Word of her ordeal had spread, and friends and family were reaching out with concern and support. One message from her best friend Sarah caught her eye. "OMG, Em. Just heard what happened. You're officially the baddest backpacker I know. When you're out, we're getting drinks and you're telling me everything." Emily couldn't help but chuckle at the message. It was a reminder that life went on, that this experience, while intense, was now a part of her story rather than the end of it. As the day wore on, Emily received visits from hospital staff, gave a brief statement to a local news reporter after getting clearance from her doctor, and spoke with the trauma counselor Dr. Chen had mentioned. Each conversation helped her process what had happened, turning the chaotic events into a coherent narrative. That evening, as the hospital settled into its night routine, Emily found herself alone with her thoughts. She looked out the window, at the distant silhouette of the mountains against the darkening sky. Despite everything, she felt a pull towards them, a desire to understand rather than fear. Emily reached for her journal, which the rescue team had thankfully recovered along with her other belongings. She began to write, pouring out her thoughts and feelings about the bear encounter, her rescue and the aftermath. As she wrote, she realized that this experience, terrifying as it was, had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. She paused, pen hovering over the paper, and then wrote, "I went into the wilderness seeking a challenge and adventure. I found both, just not in the way I expected. I've seen the raw power of nature, felt fear I never knew existed, and discovered strengths I didn't know I had. This isn't the end of my story with the wilderness, it's a new beginning." With that, Emily closed her journal and settled back in her bed. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more processing, more healing. But for now, she felt at peace, ready to face whatever came next. Her adventure in the Rockies was over, but the journey it had started was just beginning. The weeks following Emily's bear encounter and rescue passed in a blur of medical checkups, physical therapy sessions, and conversations with friends and family. As her physical wounds healed, Emily found herself grappling with the emotional aftermath of her ordeal. 6 weeks after the incident, Emily sat in her therapist's office, fidgeting with the sleeve of her sweater. Dr. Lydia Patel, a trauma specialist, recommended by the hospital, watched her with patient eyes. "How have you been sleeping, Emily?" Dr. Patel asked, her voice gentle. Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Better, I think. The nightmares aren't as frequent now, but I still wake up sometimes heart racing, thinking I hear the bear outside my window. Dr. Patel nodded understandingly. That's a normal response to trauma. Your mind is still processing what happened. Have you been practicing the grounding techniques we discussed? Yes, Emily replied. They help, especially when I feel a panic attack coming on. But, she trailed off, struggling to find the right words. But, Dr. Patel prompted. Emily took a deep breath. But I'm frustrated. I went on that hike to challenge myself, to prove I could handle the wilderness, and now I jump at every loud noise. I can't even walk in the park without constantly looking over my shoulder. It's like the bear took something from me and I don't know how to get it back. Dr. Patel leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. Emily, what you're feeling is valid. Trauma changes us, but it doesn't have to define us. You survived a terrifying experience. That strength is still in you. The goal isn't to go back to who you were before, but to integrate this experience into who you are now. Emily nodded slowly, considering the therapist's words. I think I want to go back. Back to the park? Dr. Patel asked, raising an eyebrow. Yes, Emily said, her voice growing stronger. Not alone, not yet, but I need to face it. To see those mountains again and know that I can still find peace there, despite what happened. Dr. Patel smiled. That sounds like a positive step, Emily. Just remember to be patient with yourself. Healing takes time. As Emily left the therapist's office, she felt a sense of determination she hadn't experienced since before the attack. She pulled out her phone and dialed a familiar number. Hello? Came the gruff voice of Ranger Mike. Ranger Mike. It's Emily. Turner, I think I'm ready to take you up on that offer to speak to hiking groups, and I was wondering if you could help me plan a return trip to the park. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Ranger Mike's voice came back, tinged with surprise and warmth. Emily, it's good to hear from you, and I'm glad to hear you're thinking of coming back. Why don't you come by the ranger station this weekend? We can talk details and maybe take a short walk on one of our easier trails. See how you feel. Emily agreed, and as she hung up the phone, she felt a mix of anxiety and excitement. She was taking the first step towards reclaiming her love for the outdoors. That weekend, Emily found herself standing at the entrance to Rocky Mountain National Park once again. The sight of the towering peaks and dense forests brought a flood of emotions, fear, awe, and an unexpected sense of homecoming. Ranger Mike greeted her with a warm handshake. Good to see you, Emily. How are you feeling? Emily took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. Nervous, she admitted, but good. I need to do this. Ranger Mike nodded approvingly. That's the spirit. We'll start small today. Just a short walk on a popular trail. Plenty of other hikers around, nice and open. Sound good? Emily nodded and they set off. As they walked, Ranger Mike pointed out various plants and animal signs, his calm demeanor helping to ease Emily's tension. They passed other hikers, families with children, elderly couples. The normalcy of it all began to seep into Emily, reminding her that the park was more than just the site of her trauma. About halfway through the hike, they paused at a scenic overlook. Emily gazed out at the vast expanse of wilderness before her, the same wilderness that had both terrified and awed her. You know, Ranger Mike said, breaking the silence, what happened to you was rare. But your reaction, coming back, wanting to educate others, that's rare too and valuable. Emily turned to him, curious. What do you mean? Well, he continued, a lot of people would have sworn off the wilderness entirely after what you went through. But here you are, and you want to share your story. That can help a lot of people, Emily. It reminds folks that nature isn't just beautiful, it's powerful, deserving of respect. Emily nodded slowly, a realization dawning. I think that's what I learned out there. Respect. For nature. For my own limits. For the unexpected. They continued their walk, and by the time they returned to the trailhead, Emily felt a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't the same exhilaration she had felt on her solo hike, but it was something new. A quiet confidence, a sense of having faced her fears and taken a step forward. Over the next few months, Emily worked with Ranger Mike and the Park Service to develop a series of talks for hiking groups. She shared her experience, emphasizing both the importance of proper preparation and the unpredictability of nature. Her story resonated with many, and she found that talking about her experience helped in her own healing process. Emily also continued her therapy sessions with Dr. Patel, working through her trauma and rebuilding her confidence. Slowly but surely, she began to reconnect with her love for the outdoors. She started with short day hikes in groups, then progressed to overnight trips. Each successful outing helped to replace her fearful memories with new, positive ones. 1 year after her bear encounter, Emily stood at the trailhead where her ill-fated solo journey had begun. This time, she wasn't alone. A small group of hikers, participants in one of her safety workshops, waited eagerly for her to lead them into the backcountry. As Emily did one last check of her gear, she caught sight of her reflection in her water bottle. The scar on her arm, a permanent reminder of her bear encounter, was visible beneath her rolled-up sleeve. But instead of fear, the sight now filled her with a sense of pride. It was a mark of survival, of resilience. "All right, folks," she called out to the group, her voice strong and confident. "Remember what we discussed. Stay alert, respect the wildlife, and most importantly, enjoy the beauty around you. The wilderness isn't something to be conquered. It's something to be experienced, with all its wonders and, yes, its dangers too." As they set off down the trail, Emily felt a familiar thrill of excitement. The forest stretched out before them, full of possibilities. She knew that somewhere out there bears roamed these woods, but now that knowledge brought a sense of respect rather than fear. She had faced her worst nightmare and come out stronger. Whatever challenges this trip might bring, she was ready for them. The bear attack had changed Emily, there was no denying that. But as she led her group deeper into the backcountry, she realized that change wasn't always a bad thing. She had lost her naivety but gained wisdom, lost some fearlessness but gained respect. And in the process, she had found a new purpose, sharing her love for the wilderness while helping others stay safe. As the trail wound upward into the mountains, Emily Turner smiled. Her journey of healing and rediscovery was far from over, but with each step into the wild, she was reclaiming a piece of herself. The bear may have left its mark, but the mountains had left a far deeper impression, one of beauty, challenge, and endless possibility. Now let's go to the next attack case. If you're enjoying it, leave a like and a comment telling me which city you're watching from. Let's move on to the next one. The sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Chris Walker laced up his running shoes. The cool Montana air nipped at his skin as he stepped onto the porch of his sprawling ranch house, his breath forming small clouds in front of his face. At 40 years old, Chris prided himself on maintaining the same morning routine he'd had since his 20s, a 5-mile run along the dirt road that snaked through his property and into the surrounding wilderness. "Heading out, hon," he called back into the house. His wife, Sarah, appeared in the doorway, clutching a steaming mug of coffee. "Be careful out there," she said, a hint of concern in her voice. "I heard some of the neighbors talking about bear sightings recently." Chris chuckled, stretching his arms above his head. "You worry too much. I've been running this route for years without so much as seeing a bear print." Sarah frowned. "Just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean it won't. Maybe take the truck out to the main road and run there instead." "And miss out on all this?" Chris gestured to the breathtaking landscape before them. The sun was now casting a golden glow over the distant mountains, their peaks still shrouded in early morning mist. Fields of tall grass swayed gently in the breeze, dotted with wildflowers in vibrant purples and yellows. Sarah sighed, knowing it was pointless to argue. "At least take your phone, okay?" Chris patted his pocket. "Already got it. I'll be back before you know it." With a quick kiss on Sarah's cheek, Chris jogged down the porch steps and set off down the well-worn path that led to the dirt road. The familiar crunch of gravel under his feet and the rhythmic sound of his breathing soon lulled him into a meditative state. As he ran, Chris let his mind wander. He thought about the day ahead. There was fencing that needed mending on the north side of the property, and he had to make a run into town for supplies. He also made a mental note to call the veterinarian about one of his horses that had been limping lately. The dirt road curved gently to the left, taking Chris deeper into the wilderness that surrounded his ranch. Towering pines lined either side of the path, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. In the distance, a hawk's cry pierced the morning stillness. Chris had always loved this part of his run. It was here, surrounded by nature, that he felt most at peace. The worries of ranch life, the constant struggle against the elements, and the financial pressures of keeping the operation afloat all seemed to melt away with each pounding step on the dusty road. As he rounded a bend, Chris caught sight of something that made him slow his pace. About 100 yards ahead, a fallen tree blocked part of the road. It wasn't unusual for trees to come down, especially after the strong winds they'd had last week, but it meant he'd have to alter his usual route. "Damn," Chris muttered to himself. "Guess I'll have to bring the chainsaw out here later." He approached the fallen tree, assessing the situation. The trunk was too thick to easily climb over, and the surrounding underbrush was too dense to go around. Chris stood there for a moment, hands on his hips, considering his options. "Well, no use turning back now," he said aloud, his voice sounding oddly loud in the quiet forest. Chris decided to push on, deviating from his usual path and heading into the trees alongside the road. He'd run cross-country in college, and the thought of navigating the uneven terrain brought a smile to his face. It would be a nice change of pace from the monotony of the dirt road. As he ventured deeper into the forest, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The usual chorus of birdsong had gone quiet, and there was a heaviness to the air that hadn't been there before. He slowed his pace, suddenly aware of every snapping twig and rustling leaf beneath his feet. "Get a grip, Walker," he chided himself. "You're letting Sarah's worrying get to you." But even as he tried to shake off the unease, Chris found himself scanning the trees more intently. The shadows seemed deeper here, the forest more primeval. He quickened his pace, eager to get back to the familiar comfort of the dirt road. That's when he heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to reverberate through the very ground beneath his feet. Chris froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Slowly he turned his head towards the source of the sound. There, not 30 feet away, stood a massive grizzly bear. Its shaggy brown fur was matted in places, and its small dark eyes were fixed intently on Chris. The bear's lips were pulled back in a snarl, revealing yellowed teeth the size of Chris's fingers. Time seemed to stand still as man and beast regarded each other. In that moment, all of Chris's knowledge about bear encounters flew out of his head. Should he run? Play dead? Try to scare it off? His mind raced, but his body remained rooted to the spot. The bear let out another growl, this one louder and more menacing than the first. It took a lumbering step forward, its massive paws leaving deep impressions in the soft forest floor. Chris's survival instincts finally kicked in. Remembering the safety protocols he'd learned years ago, he began to slowly back away, keeping his eyes lowered to avoid direct eye contact with the bear. His heart was hammering so loudly in his ears that he could barely hear the sound of his own ragged breathing. "Easy there, big fella," Chris said in what he hoped was a calm, soothing voice. "I'm not here to cause any trouble, just passing through." The bear tilted its head slightly, as if considering Chris's words. For a brief moment, Chris allowed himself to hope that the encounter might end peacefully. But then, the wind shifted, carrying Chris's scent directly to the bear, and everything changed. With a roar that seemed to shake the very trees, the grizzly reared up on its hind legs. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, its massive frame blotting out the morning sun. Chris stumbled backward, his foot catching on a tree root, and he went sprawling onto his back. As he scrambled to his feet, Chris heard the thunderous sound of the bear charging. Panic overtook him, and despite knowing it was futile, he turned and ran. The forest blurred around him as he sprinted, branches whipping at his face and arms. He could hear the bear crashing through the underbrush behind him, gaining ground with every second. Chris's lungs burned as he pushed himself harder than he ever had before. The dirt road came into view ahead, and with it a glimmer of hope. If he could just make it to open ground, maybe he'd have a chance. But as he burst out of the tree line and onto the road, Chris realized his mistake. He'd run in the wrong direction, away from his ranch and deeper into the wilderness. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and in that moment of hesitation, he heard the bear's labored breathing right behind him. Chris Walker, seasoned rancher and lifelong Montanan, felt true fear grip his heart. As he prepared to face the charging grizzly, one thought flashed through his mind. Sarah was right. I should have taken the damn truck. As Chris spun around to face the charging grizzly, time seemed to slow to a crawl. The massive bear's paws thundered against the dirt road, kicking up small clouds of dust with each impact. Its eyes, dark and filled with primal fury, were locked onto Chris. In that moment, all of his years of experience living in bear country crystallized into a single crucial decision. "Don't run," Chris muttered to himself, fighting every instinct screaming at him to flee. "Don't run, don't run, don't run." With his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat, Chris forced himself to stand his ground. He spread his arms wide, trying to make himself appear as large as possible, and took a deep breath. "Hey!" he bellowed, his voice echoing through the trees. "Get out of here! Go on, get!" The bear, seemingly startled by Chris's sudden show of aggression, skidded to a halt about 20 feet away. It dropped back down to all fours, regarding Chris with what almost looked like confusion. For a tense moment, neither man nor beast moved. Chris kept his arms spread, trying to control his ragged breathing. "That's right," he said, his voice low and steady. "You don't want any part of this. Just turn around and go back to your—" His words were cut short as the bear let out a deafening roar. Chris flinched involuntarily but held his position. The grizzly rose up on its hind legs again, easily towering over Chris's 6-foot frame. "Oh shit," Chris whispered, realizing his show of bravado might have just made things worse. Just as he was considering whether to try playing dead or making a run for it, a new sound cut through the tension, the distant rumble of an engine. The bear's ears perked up, swiveling towards the noise. Chris didn't dare take his eyes off the grizzly, but he silently prayed that whoever was driving would come around the bend soon. As if in answer to his prayers, a battered old pickup truck came into view, its engine sputtering and coughing. The bear, startled by the unexpected intrusion, dropped back down to all fours and quickly lumbered off into the underbrush. Chris sagged with relief, his legs suddenly feeling like jelly. The truck pulled up beside him, and a weathered face peered out from the driver's side window. "You all right there, son?" asked the old man behind the wheel. His face was a maze of wrinkles, topped by a shock of white hair poking out from under a well-worn Stetson. Chris nodded, still trying to catch his breath. Yeah, I'm okay, thanks to you. That was close." The old man chuckled, though there was concern in his eyes. "Looks like you had yourself a right proper standoff with old Gus there." "Gus?" Chris asked, bewildered. "That's what we call him round these parts," the old man explained. "Been causing trouble for a few years now. Ornery old cuss, but usually keeps to himself." He paused, eyeing Chris critically. "You're the Walker boy, ain't you? From the Triple W ranch down the way?" Chris nodded, finally feeling his heartbeat start to slow. "That's right, Chris Walker. And you are—" "Name's Earl Hawkins. Got a little place up the mountain a ways." Earl jerked his thumb over his shoulder. "Hop in. I'll give you a ride back to your ranch. Reckon you've had enough excitement for one morning." Gratefully, Chris climbed into the passenger seat of Earl's truck. As they started down the road, the events of the past few minutes began to sink in. He'd come face to face with a grizzly and lived to tell the tale. "I can't believe I stood my ground like that," Chris said, half to himself. Earl nodded approvingly. "So you did good, son. Most folks would have turned tail and run. That's about the worst thing you can do with a grizzly." "I know," Chris replied. "I've lived here all my life, but this is the first time I've ever had a close encounter like that. Always thought I knew what to do. But when it actually happened—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Knowledge is one thing," Earl said sagely. "Putting it into practice when you're staring down 800 pounds of angry bear is something else entirely. You kept your wits about you. That's what matters." As they drove, Earl filled Chris in on the recent bear activity in the area. Apparently, a Gus had been spotted more frequently in the past few weeks, venturing closer to populated areas than usual. "Fish and wildlife's been keeping an eye on him," Earl explained. "But you know how it is. They can't be everywhere at once, and Gus is crafty. Been dodging their attempts to relocate him for years." Chris nodded, his mind racing. He thought about his daily runs, about Sarah working in the garden, about their neighbors and their livestock. "Maybe we need to organize some kind of community watch," he mused. "Keep each other informed about sightings, that sort of thing." Earl grunted in agreement. "Not a bad idea." Might want to talk to Ranger Mitchell about that. She's been trying to get something like that going for a while now. As they approached the turnoff to the Triple W ranch, Chris felt a mix of relief and lingering adrenaline. He was eager to see Sarah, to feel the comfort of home, but he also knew that his perspective had shifted. The wilderness he'd always seen, as a source of peace and beauty, now held a new edge of danger. Earl pulled up to the ranch house where Sarah was pacing on the front porch. As soon as she saw Chris, she ran down the steps, her face a mask of worry. "Chris, oh my God, are you okay? You've been gone for hours." She threw her arms around him as he climbed out of the truck. "I'm fine, honey," Chris assured her, holding her tight. "Had a bit of a close call, but I'm okay. Thanks to Earl here." Sarah turned to the old man who was climbing out of his truck. "Thank you so much, Mr. Hawkins. I don't know what I would have done if—" Earl waved off her thanks with a weathered hand. "No need for that, ma'am. Just doing what any neighbor would do." He tipped his hat to them both. "You folks take care now, and Chris, maybe stick to the main roads for your runs for a while, yeah?" As Earl drove off, Sarah turned back to Chris, her eyes searching his face. "What happened out there? You look like you've seen a ghost." Chris took a deep breath, the reality of his encounter still sinking in. "Not a ghost, honey. Something a lot more real. Let's go inside. I've got quite a story to tell you." As they walked up to the house, Chris draped his arm over Sarah's shoulders, pulling her close. The familiar scent of her shampoo and the warmth of her body against his side helped to ground him, to remind him that he was safe. But as he glanced back at the tree line in the distance, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. The wilderness he'd always taken for granted now held a new mystery, a primal energy that both thrilled and terrified him. As he stepped into his home, Chris Walker knew that his relationship with the Montana wilderness would never be quite the same again. The next morning, Chris found himself standing on the porch, staring out at the dirt road where he usually began his run. The rising sun painted the sky in hues of pink and orange, but the beauty was lost on him. His mind kept replaying yesterday's encounter with the grizzly bear. Sarah appeared beside him, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands. "You're not thinking of going out there again, are you?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Chris shook his head. "No, not today. But I can't avoid it forever. This is our home, Sarah. We can't live in fear," she sighed, handing him the mug. "I know, but promise me you'll be more careful from now on. Maybe carry some bear spray." "Yeah, I'll pick some up when I head into town later," Chris agreed, taking a sip of coffee. The hot liquid helped to clear the fog from his mind, but it did little to settle the unease in his gut. After breakfast, Chris decided to drive into town to run some errands and pick up supplies. As he climbed into his pickup truck, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. This was the first time in years he'd skipped his morning run. The drive into town was uneventful, the familiar landscape rolling by outside the window. Chris found himself scanning the tree line more intently than usual, half expecting to see a massive brown shape lumbering between the pines. At the general store, Chris loaded up on supplies, feed for the horses, some new fencing wire, and a few other ranch necessities. As he was checking out, he noticed a display of bear spray near the counter. "Heard about your run-in with old Gus yesterday," the store owner Bill said as he rang up Chris's purchases. "Nasty business that. You gonna get some of this?" He nodded towards the bear spray. Chris nodded, grabbing 2 cans. "Better safe than sorry, I guess. Seems like everyone knows about what happened." Bill chuckled. "Small town, my friend. News travels fast, especially when it's about a bear. You're lucky Earl came along when he did." As Chris was loading his supplies into the truck, he heard someone call his name. He turned to see Ranger Mitchell approaching, her forest green uniform crisp in the morning sun. "Morning, Chris," she said, her face serious. "Got a minute to chat?" Chris nodded, leaning against his truck. "Sure thing, Ranger. What's on your mind?" "Heard about your encounter yesterday," she began, her brow furrowed with concern. "I wanted to check in, see how you're doing. And also, well, I need to ask you a few questions if that's all right." "Of course," Chris replied. "What do you need to know?" For the next several minutes, Ranger Mitchell grilled Chris about every detail of his encounter with the grizzly. Where exactly had it happened? How big was the bear? Did it display any unusual behavior? Chris answered as best he could, trying to recall every moment of the terrifying experience. "Thanks, Chris," Ranger Mitchell said when she'd finished her questions. "This information will help us track Gus's movements. We've been trying to relocate him for a while now, but he's proven elusive." Chris nodded, a thought occurring to him. "Earl mentioned something about a community watch program. Is that something you're working on?" Ranger Mitchell's face lit up. "As a matter of fact, yes. We're trying to get locals more involved in bear awareness and safety. Would you be interested in helping out?" "Absolutely," Chris replied without hesitation. "After yesterday, I think it's more important than ever." They chatted for a few more minutes, with Ranger Mitchell promising to send Chris some information about the Community Watch program. As she walked away, Chris felt a sense of purpose starting to replace the fear that had been gnawing at him since yesterday. Back at the ranch, Chris spent the afternoon mending fences and tending to the horses. The physical labor helped to clear his mind, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the bushes, every snapping twig made him tense up. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the property, Chris decided to call it a day. He gathered his tools and began the walk back to the house. That's when he heard it, a low, rumbling growl coming from the tree line. Chris froze, his heart rate skyrocketing. Slowly he turned towards the sound, his hand instinctively reaching for the bear spray on his belt. There at the edge of the forest stood a massive grizzly bear. Even from this distance, Chris recognized it as the same bear from yesterday. "Gus," he whispered, his mouth suddenly dry. The bear stood on its hind legs, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Chris knew he should make noise, try to scare it off, but he found himself paralyzed with fear. All he could do was watch, as the grizzly dropped back down to all fours and began to lumber towards him. "Chris!" Sarah's voice cut through the tension like a knife. She was standing on the porch, a shotgun in her hands. The sound startled both Chris and the bear, snapping. Out of his trance, Chris began to back away slowly, keeping his eyes on the bear. "Easy, Gus," he said, his voice shaking. "You don't want any trouble." The bear hesitated, seemingly confused by Chris's retreat. It took another step forward, then stopped, its head swiveling between Chris and Sarah on the porch. "Get back, you damned beast," Sarah yelled, firing a warning shot into the air. The loud crack of the shotgun echoed across the property. The bear reared up again, letting out a roar that Chris felt in his bones. For a heart-stopping moment he thought the bear might charge, but then, as quickly as it had appeared, the grizzly turned and lumbered back into the forest. Chris watched it go, his legs feeling like jelly. He stumbled towards the house where Sarah was rushing down to meet him. "Are you okay?" she asked, her face pale with fear. "I saw it from the window. I thought... Chris pulled her into a tight embrace, his heart still racing. "I'm okay," he assured her, though his voice was shaky. "Thanks to you." That was some quick thinking with the shotgun. As they stood there, holding each other in the fading light, Chris realized that this encounter had been different. The fear was still there, yes, but it was tempered now by something else. A determination. A resolve. "We need to do something about this," he said, pulling back to look Sarah in the eye. "We can't live like this, always looking over our shoulders. There has to be a way to coexist with these animals without putting ourselves in danger." Sarah nodded, her initial fear giving way to a steely determination that matched his own. "You're right. But how?" Chris thought about his conversation with Ranger Mitchell earlier that day. "I think I have an idea," he said, "but it's going to take the whole community to make it work." As they walked back to the house arm in arm, Chris's mind was already racing with plans. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Dealing with a bear like Gus would require patience, understanding, and a whole lot of courage. But as he looked out at the wild beauty of the Montana landscape, Chris knew it was worth the effort. This was their home, after all, and they weren't about to let fear drive them away. The community hall buzzed with nervous energy as residents of the small Montana town filed in, their faces etched with concern. Chris Walker stood near the front, exchanging nods with familiar faces. The events of the past few days had shaken the community, and tonight's meeting, hastily organized by Ranger Mitchell, was a testament to the growing unease. As the last stragglers took their seats, Ranger Mitchell stepped up to the podium. Her uniform was crisp, her demeanor professional, but Chris could see the strain in her eyes. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice carrying across the room. "As many of you know, we've had an increase in bear activity in our area, particularly involving a grizzly we've been calling Gus." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Chris felt eyes turning towards him, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Ranger," Mitchell continued, "I know there's been a lot of talk and some fear circulating in town. That's why we're here tonight, to address your concerns and discuss how we can move forward as a community." She went on to outline the recent bear sightings, including Chris's encounter. As she spoke, Chris found himself reliving those terrifying moments on the trail. His palms grew sweaty and he wiped them on his jeans. "Now I'd like to invite Chris Walker to come up and share his experience," Ranger Mitchell said, gesturing towards him. Chris took a deep breath and stood up. As he made his way to the front, he could feel the weight of everyone's gaze. Sarah gave his hand a reassuring squeeze as he passed. Standing at the podium, Chris looked out at the sea of familiar faces. He saw concern, fear, and curiosity in their eyes. Clearing his throat, he began to recount his encounter with Gus. "I've lived here all my life," he started, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger. "I've always known there were bears in these parts, but I never really worried about them. That changed a few days ago." As Chris described the heart-pounding moments of his face-off with Gus, the room fell silent. He could see people leaning forward in their seats, hanging on every word. "I was lucky," Chris concluded. "If Earl hadn't come along when he did, well, I might not be standing here today, but this isn't just about me. This is about all of us. We need to figure out how to live alongside these animals without putting ourselves in danger." As Chris stepped back from the podium, the room erupted in a cacophony of voices. People were calling out questions, sharing their own stories of bear encounters, and expressing their fears. Ranger Mitchell raised her hands, trying to restore order. "Please, one at a time. We're here to work together, not talk over each other." An older woman in the front row stood up. "What about hunting?" she asked, her voice quavering. "Can't we just get rid of this bear?" A chorus of agreement rose from some quarters of the room, but Chris noticed others shaking their heads. Ranger Mitchell's face grew stern. "Hunting is not the answer here. Gus is a protected species, and more importantly, killing one bear won't solve the larger issue. We need sustainable long-term solutions." "Then what do you suggest?" a man called out from the back. "We can't just sit around waiting to be attacked." Chris found himself stepping forward again. "If I may," he said, looking to Ranger Mitchell. "For permission." She nodded, and he turned to face the crowd. "I've been thinking about this a lot since my encounter," Chris began, "and I believe the key is education and preparation. We need to learn how to coexist with these animals. That means understanding their behavior, knowing how to avoid attracting them, and being prepared if we do encounter one." He paused, gauging the room's reaction. Some people were nodding, while others still looked skeptical. "I propose we start a community bear awareness program," Chris continued. "We could have regular training sessions on bear safety, set up a system to alert each other about bear sightings, and work on making our properties less attractive to bears." Ranger Mitchell stepped up beside him. "That's exactly the kind of initiative we've been hoping for," she said, a note of approval in her voice. "The Forest Service can provide resources and expertise, but it's up to all of you to make it work." The room buzzed with conversation as people discussed the idea. Chris could see the mood shifting, fear giving way to a cautious sense of empowerment. Sarah stood up, her voice clear and strong. "I think it's a great idea. After what happened at our ranch, I realized how unprepared we were. If we all work together, share information, maybe we can prevent something worse from happening." Her words seemed to galvanize the room. More people began to voice their support, offering ideas and volunteering to help. As the meeting wound down, Ranger Mitchell called for a show of hands. "Who's willing to be part of this community bear awareness program?" Slowly at first, then, with growing enthusiasm, hands began to rise. Chris felt a surge of relief and pride as he watched his neighbors commit to facing this challenge together. After the meeting, as people filed out of the hall, many stopped to talk to Chris. Some shared their own bear stories, while others offered words of support or asked how they could help. Earl Hawkins clapped Chris on the shoulder. "You did good up there, son. Turned a scary situation into something positive. Your daddy would be proud." Chris felt a lump form in his throat at the mention of his father. "Thanks, Earl. That means a lot." As the last of the attendees left, Ranger Mitchell approached Chris and Sarah. "I can't thank you enough for stepping up like this," she said. "Your story, your willingness to take action. It's made a real difference tonight." Chris nodded, feeling a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. "It's a start," he said, "but we've got a lot of work ahead of us." Sarah slipped her hand into his. "We'll face it together," she said, "all of us." As they walked out into the cool night air, Chris felt a sense of cautious optimism. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of his mind, but it was tempered now by determination and a sense of community. He looked up at the star-filled sky, the silhouette of the mountains, a dark presence on the horizon. Somewhere out there, Gus was roaming, following instincts as old as the land itself. But now Chris and his neighbors were better prepared to share that land. It wouldn't be easy, he knew. There would be challenges ahead, maybe even more close calls. But as he and Sarah drove home, Chris felt a renewed sense of purpose. They weren't just protecting themselves, they were finding a way to preserve the wild beauty of Montana while keeping their community safe. The road ahead was uncertain, but they would face it together, one step at a time. The early morning mist hung low over the fields as Chris Walker laced up his running shoes. It had been 2 weeks since the community meeting, and life had slowly begun to return to a semblance of normalcy. The Bear Awareness Program was off to a strong start, with regular training sessions and a new alert system in place. Despite the progress, Chris couldn't shake the lingering anxiety that had taken root since his encounter with Gus. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her brow furrowed with concern. "Are you sure about this, Chris? Maybe you should wait until the fog clears." Chris stood up, testing the weight of the bear spray canister on his belt. "I can't keep putting it off, honey. I need to get back out there." Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. She stepped forward and straightened the collar of his running jacket. "Just be careful, okay, and keep your phone on you." "Always," Chris replied, giving her a quick kiss. He patted his pocket, feeling the reassuring bulk of his cell phone. "I'll stick to the main road today, I promise." As Chris set off down the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath his feet, he felt a mix of anticipation and dread. The fog muffled the usual morning sounds, creating an eerie stillness. He found himself straining his ears for any unusual noises as he jogged, his eyes constantly scanning the misty tree line. About a mile into his run, Chris's phone buzzed. He slowed to a walk, pulling it out to check the screen. It was a notification from the new Bear Alert app they'd set up as part of the awareness program. His heart rate quickened as he read the message. "Bear sighting reported near Wilson Creek, approximately 2 miles east of town. Exercise caution." Chris glanced around, getting his bearings. He was heading in the opposite direction of the sighting, but the news still set him on edge. He debated turning back but decided to press on. He'd come this far, and he was determined to complete his usual route. As he rounded a bend in the road, the mist began to thin, revealing the lush Montana landscape. The sight of the familiar terrain bathed in the soft morning light helped to ease some of Chris's tension. He picked up his pace, falling into the rhythm he'd missed these past weeks. The sound of an approaching vehicle broke through his concentration. Chris moved to the side of the road, turning to see a Forest Service truck slowing down beside him. The window rolled down, revealing Ranger Mitchell's face. "Morning, Chris," she called out. "Glad to see you back out here." Chris nodded, jogging in place. "Morning, Ranger. Just trying to get back into my routine." Ranger Mitchell's expression turned serious. "I assume you got the alert about the bear sighting?" "Yeah, just a few minutes ago. But it was in the other direction, right?" She nodded. "That's right. But I wanted to give you a heads up. We've been tracking Gus, and he's been on the move. There's a chance he could be in this area." Chris felt his stomach tighten. "Thanks for the warning. I'll keep an eye out." "Do you want to ride back to your place?" Ranger Mitchell offered. "I'd feel better knowing you're not out here alone." For a moment, Chris was tempted to accept. The thought of cutting his run short and returning to the safety of his truck was appealing, but something inside him rebelled against the idea. He couldn't let fear dictate his life. "I appreciate it, but I think I'll finish my run," Chris said, surprising himself with the steadiness in his voice. I've got my bear spray and I'll stay alert." Ranger Mitchell looked like she wanted to argue, but instead gave a resigned nod. "All right, but be careful, and don't hesitate to call if you need anything." As the truck pulled away, Chris took a deep breath and resumed his run. The fog had lifted considerably now, and he could see the mountains in the distance, their peaks catching the first rays of the morning sun. The familiar sight bolstered his confidence. He had covered another mile when he heard it, a rustling in the underbrush just off the road. Chris slowed to a stop, his hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on his belt. His eyes scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the still morning air. "Anyone there?" There was no response, but the rustling continued. Chris's mind raced, remembering the techniques they'd discussed in the bear awareness meetings. "Stay calm. Make yourself known. Back away slowly." He was about to start backing up when a figure emerged from the trees. But it wasn't the massive form of a grizzly bear. Instead, a young deer stepped cautiously onto the road, its large eyes fixed on Chris. The tension drained from Chris's body, replaced by a mixture of relief and embarrassment. He let out a shaky laugh. "You had me going there for a second, little fella." The deer regarded him for a moment before bounding across the road and disappearing into the trees on the other side. Chris watched it go, marveling at the grace and speed of the animal. As he stood there catching his breath, Chris realized something. The fear was still there, a constant presence in the back of his mind, but it no longer paralyzed him. He had faced it, pushed through it, and come out the other side. With renewed determination, Chris resumed his run. The rest of the route passed without incident, and as he approached his driveway, he felt a sense of accomplishment washing over him. He had reclaimed this part of his life, this connection to the land he loved. Sarah was waiting on the porch, relief evident on her face as she saw him approach. "How was it?" she called out. Chris jogged up the steps, pulling her into a sweaty hug. "It was good," he said, surprised to find he meant it. Really good. As they walked into the house together, Chris felt a shift within himself. The wilderness that surrounded their home was still dangerous, still unpredictable. Gus was still out there somewhere, but Chris no longer felt like a helpless victim. He was part of this ecosystem, and he was learning to navigate it with respect and caution. "You know," he said to Sarah as he poured himself a glass of water, "I think I'm ready to start planning that camping trip we talked about last summer." Sarah's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Are you sure, after everything that's happened?" Chris nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "I'm sure. We can't let fear keep us from living our lives. We just need to be prepared. Be smart about it." Sarah hugged him. Chris looked out the window at the vast Montana landscape. The beauty of it struck him anew, and he felt a deep gratitude for this place they called home. They were finding a way to coexist with the wild, to respect its power while embracing its wonder. It wouldn't always be easy, he knew. There would be more challenges ahead, more moments of fear. But as he stood there, holding Sarah, Chris felt ready to face whatever came their way. They were part of this land, and they would find a way to thrive here, bears and all. The campfire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the faces of Chris and Sarah Walker as they sat beneath a canopy of stars. They had chosen a spot in a clearing not far from their ranch, close enough to feel safe but far enough to be immersed in the wilderness. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. "This was a good idea," Sarah said, snuggling closer to Chris. "I can't remember the last time we did this." Chris nodded, his arm around her shoulders. "Too long. We've let fear keep us from enjoying our own backyard for too long." As they sat in comfortable silence, Chris found his mind wandering back to the events of the past few weeks. The Bear Awareness program had taken off, with more and more community members getting involved. They'd installed bear-proof trash cans throughout town, held workshops on proper food storage while camping, and even started a volunteer patrol to monitor bear activity in the area. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond the firelight, causing both Chris and Sarah to tense. They listened intently, hands instinctively moving towards the bear spray they'd placed within easy reach. "Probably just a deer," Chris said after a moment, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Sarah nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the shadows. "Maybe we should turn in for the night." Chris was about to agree when a low, rumbling growl echoed through the clearing. It was a sound he'd hoped never to hear again, one that sent a chill down his spine despite the warmth of the fire. "Sarah," he whispered, slowly rising to his feet. "Get the bear spray and the flashlight." As Sarah fumbled for the items, Chris strained his eyes, trying to pierce the darkness. The growl came again, closer this time. He could hear the sound of heavy footsteps, branches cracking under significant weight. "Chris," Sarah's voice was barely audible, thick with fear. "It's him, isn't it? It's Gus." Before Chris could respond, a massive shape emerged from the tree line. In the flickering firelight, he could make out the hulking form of a grizzly bear. Its fur was a mottled brown, its small eyes reflecting the flames as it regarded them with what seemed like curiosity mixed with aggression. "Easy now," Chris said, his voice surprisingly steady. He raised his arms, trying to make himself look bigger. "We don't want any trouble, big fella." The bear huffed, taking another step forward. Chris could feel Sarah trembling beside him, her grip on the bear spray white-knuckled. "What do we do?" she whispered. Chris's mind raced, recalling all the training they'd been through. "Slowly back away towards the truck," he said. "No sudden movements, keep your eyes on him, but don't make direct eye contact." They began to edge backwards, step by agonizing step. The bear watched them, occasionally swaying, its massive head from side to side. It seemed unsure, as if it was trying to decide whether they were a threat or potential food. They had made it about halfway to their truck when disaster struck. Sarah's foot caught on a protruding root, sending her stumbling backward. The sudden movement startled the bear, and it let out a deafening roar. "Sarah, spray!" Chris yelled as the bear started to charge. With shaking hands, Sarah raised the canister and pressed down on the nozzle. A cloud of peppery spray erupted, catching the bear full in the face as it closed the distance. The effect was immediate. The grizzly reared up on its hind legs, pawing at its eyes and nose. It let out a bellow of pain and confusion, shaking its massive head from side to side. "Run!" Chris grabbed Sarah's hand, and they sprinted towards the truck. Behind them, they could hear the bear crashing around, still disoriented from the spray. They reached the vehicle, fumbling with the doors in their panic. As they climbed inside, Chris could see the bear in the rearview mirror, still thrashing about in obvious distress. "Go, go, go," Sarah urged as Chris started the engine. The tires spun in the soft earth before finding purchase, and they lurched forward. Chris navigated carefully but quickly through the trees, his heart pounding in his ears. It wasn't until they reached the main road that he allowed himself to relax slightly. "Are you okay?" he asked, glancing over at Sarah. She nodded, her face pale in the dashboard light. "Yeah, I think so. You?" "I'm all right," Chris said, though his hands were shaking on the steering wheel. That was too close." As the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of what had just happened sank in. They had come face to face with Gus again, and this time they'd had to use the bear spray. The encounter had been brief, but intense, leaving them both shaken. "We need to report this," Sarah said after a few minutes of silence. "Ranger Mitchell needs to know." Chris nodded, reaching for his phone. He dialed the ranger's number, half expecting it to go to voicemail given the late hour. To his surprise, she answered on the second ring. "Chris, is everything all right?" Ranger Mitchell's voice was alert, despite the hour. "We're okay, but we just had an encounter with Gus," Chris explained, recounting the events of the evening. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm glad you're both safe," Ranger Mitchell said finally. "You did the right thing with the bear spray. Where are you now?" "Heading back to the ranch," Chris replied. "We left all our camping gear behind." "Don't worry about that for now," the ranger assured him. "Get yourselves home safely. I'll send a team out to secure the area and retrieve your belongings in the morning." After hanging up, Chris and Sarah drove in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The encounter had been terrifying, but as the initial shock wore off, Chris found himself analyzing what had happened. You know," he said finally. "We handled that pretty well." Sarah looked at him incredulously. "We ran away screaming and sprayed a bear in the face. How is that handling it well?" Chris couldn't help but chuckle. "Well, when you put it like that. But seriously, think about it. We stayed calm, we used the spray correctly, and we got out of there safely. A few months ago, we might have panicked completely." Sarah considered this for a moment before nodding slowly. I guess you're right. All that training did pay off. As they pulled up to their ranch house, Chris felt a mix of emotions washing over him. There was relief, certainly, at being home safe, but there was also a strange sense of accomplishment. They had faced their fears head-on and come out the other side. What now? Sarah asked as they walked up to the house. Chris paused on the porch, looking out at the darkness that surrounded their property. The wilderness that had seemed so threatening earlier now felt different, not safe exactly, but familiar, a challenge to be respected rather than feared. Now, he said, putting his arm around Sarah, we keep going. We learn from this. We adapt, and we don't let it stop us from living our lives. Sarah leaned into him, nodding. You're right. This is our home. All of it. Bears and all. As they stepped inside, Chris felt a renewed sense of determination. The encounter with Gus had been scary, no doubt about it, but it had also shown them that they were capable of handling such situations. They were part of this ecosystem, learning to coexist with its wild inhabitants. Tomorrow they would deal with the aftermath. There would be reports to file, gear to retrieve, and probably some community meetings to attend. But for now they were safe, they were home, and they were stronger for the experience. The Montana wilderness had tested them once again, and once again they had risen to the challenge. It wouldn't be the last test, Chris knew, but he felt ready to face whatever came next. This was their home and they weren't going anywhere. The morning sun had barely crested the mountains when Chris and Sarah Walker found themselves back at their abandoned campsite, accompanied by Ranger Mitchell and her team. The clearing had looked different in the harsh light of day, less mysterious but no less intimidating given the events of the previous night. Over here, Chris called out, pointing to a set of massive paw prints in the soft earth near their extinguished campfire. This is where we first saw him. Ranger Mitchell crouched down, examining the tracks closely. Her face was a mask of professional concentration, but Chris could see the concern in her eyes. These are fresh, she muttered, more to herself than to the others. He's been through here again after you left. Sarah, who had been gathering their scattered camping gear, paused to look over. You mean he came back? Why would he do that? The ranger stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. Bears are curious creatures and they have excellent memories. He probably came back to investigate the unfamiliar scents you left behind. She turned to face Chris and Sarah directly. I can't stress enough how lucky you two were. Gus is becoming increasingly bold, and that's a dangerous combination with his size and strength. Chris nodded, a chill running down his spine despite the warming day. What does this mean for the community? For the Bear Awareness Program? Ranger Mitchell sighed, her gaze sweeping across the clearing. It means we need to step up our efforts. The program is good. It's teaching people how to coexist with wildlife, but with Gus, she trailed off, shaking her head, we might need to consider more drastic measures. Like what? Sarah asked, her voice tight with concern. Relocation is always an option, but it's not without its risks. For now, we'll increase patrols in the area and put out additional warnings. I'd like you both to come down to the station later to file a formal report, if you don't mind. As they finished packing up the campsite, Chris couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. The encounter with Gus had been terrifying, yes, but there was something else bothering him. A sense that this was more than just a random encounter, that there was a pattern forming that he couldn't quite see yet. Back at the ranch, Chris and Sarah spent the morning making calls to family, to neighbors, to members of the Bear Awareness Program. News of their encounter spread quickly through the tight-knit community, and by lunchtime their phone was ringing off the hook with concerned friends checking in. I think we need to call another community meeting, Chris said as they sat at the kitchen table, picking at sandwiches neither of them had much appetite for. People are scared, and they have a right to know what's going on. Sarah nodded, her eyes distant. Do you think we're doing the right thing? Trying to coexist like this? Maybe those people at the first meeting were right. Maybe we should be looking at more permanent solutions. Chris reached across the table, taking her hand in his. Hey, look, at me. We're doing the right thing. It's not easy, and last night was, well, it was terrifying. But this is our home. We can't just give up on finding a way to live here safely. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Chris opened it to find Earl Hawkins standing on their porch, his weathered face creased with concern. "Heard about what happened," Earl said without preamble. "You two all right?" Chris nodded, stepping back to let the older man in. "We're okay, Earl. Shaken up, but okay." Earl settled into a chair at the kitchen table, accepting a cup of coffee from Sarah with a grateful nod. "This business with Gus, it's stirring up a lot of old memories for folks around here. Talk in town is starting to turn ugly." "What do you mean?" Chris asked, leaning against the counter. Earl sighed, his gnarled hands wrapped around the steaming mug. "Some people are talking about taking matters into their own hands, hunting parties if you catch my drift," Sarah gasped. "But that's illegal. Gus is protected." "Laws don't mean much to scared people," Earl said grimly, "and folks are plenty scared right now." Chris felt a surge of frustration. This was exactly what they'd been trying to avoid with the Bear Awareness Program. "We can't let that happen," he said firmly. "It would undo everything we've been working towards." Earl nodded in agreement. "That's why I'm here. I figured if anyone could talk some sense into people, it'd be you two. You've faced Gus twice now and lived to tell the tale. People respect that." As they discussed strategies for addressing the community's fears, Chris found his mind drifting back to the encounter in the woods. There was something about Gus's behavior that didn't quite add up. The bear had seemed almost deliberate, in its actions more so than a wild animal should be. "Earl," Chris said suddenly, interrupting the conversation, "you've been around these parts longer than anyone. Have you ever heard of a bear behaving like this before? Coming back to the same areas, seeking out human encounters?" The old man's bushy eyebrows furrowed in thought. "Can't say that I have." "It's not exactly, but—" He paused, seeming to wrestle with whether to continue. "But what?" Sarah prompted. Earl sighed heavily. "There were stories back when I was a boy, old legends the native folks used to tell, about spirit bears, creatures that weren't quite animal, weren't quite something else. Guardians of the land, some called them, or punishers of those who didn't respect the natural order." Chris and Sarah exchanged glances. Under normal circumstances, they might have dismissed such talk as superstition, but after their encounters with Gus, the line between rational explanation and the inexplicable seemed increasingly blurry. "You don't really think—" Sarah began, but Earl cut her off with a wave of his hand. "I don't know what to think," he said gruffly. "All I know is that bear of yours ain't acting normal, and normal solutions might not be enough to deal with him." As Earl's words hung in the air, Chris felt a shift in his perspective. They had been approaching the Gus situation as a simple wildlife management issue, but what if it was something more? What if, in their efforts to assert control over their environment, they had disturbed something fundamental about the balance of this place? "We need to tread carefully," Chris said finally. "Whatever Gus is, whatever's driving him, we need to find a way to address this that respects the land and the creatures that live here, including us." Sarah nodded slowly, a determined look settling on her face. "So what do we do now?" Chris stood up, his mind made up. "We call that meeting. We talk to people, calm their fears, and then we go back out there. We need to understand Gus, really understand him, if we're going to find a solution that works for everyone." As they began to plan their next steps, Chris felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. They were venturing into unknown territory, challenging not just their own preconceptions, but those of their entire community. It wouldn't be easy, but as he looked at Sarah and Earl, he knew they weren't in this alone. Whatever Gus represented, be it a natural force, a spirit of the land, or simply a bear pushed to the brink by human encroachment, they would face it together. And in doing so, perhaps they would discover a new way of living in harmony with the wild, untamed heart of Montana. The community hall was packed to capacity, a tense murmur filling the air as Chris Walker made his way to the front of the room. Faces both familiar and unfamiliar turned to watch him, their expressions a mix of curiosity, fear, and barely contained anger. Chris could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him as he took his place behind the podium. Ranger. Mitchell stood to one side, her face a mask of professional calm. Sarah sat in the front row, offering Chris an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, Chris began to speak. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. I know there's been a lot of talk, a lot of fear spreading through our community since Sarah and I had our encounter with Gus. A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd at the mention of the bear's name. Chris pressed on. I'm not here to downplay the danger. Gus is a real threat and we need to take this situation seriously, but I'm also here to tell you that reacting out of fear, taking matters into our own hands, that's not the answer. Easy for you to say, a voice called out from the back of the room. You're not the one who lost livestock to that monster. Chris recognized the speaker as Mike Harding, a local rancher who'd been vocal about his opposition to the bear awareness program from the start. You're right, Mike, Chris acknowledged. I haven't lost livestock, but I have come face to face with Gus twice now. I know how terrifying it is, but I also know that if we let fear drive our actions, we're going to make this situation worse, not better. He paused, looking out over the sea of faces. We've made progress with our bear awareness program. We've learned how to coexist with the wildlife around us, but Gus is different, and that means we need to approach this differently. Ranger Mitchell stepped forward. Chris is right, she said. We're dealing with an unusual situation here. Gus's behavior doesn't fit the normal patterns we see in grizzlies. That's why we're proposing a new approach. A hush fell over the room as people leaned in, eager to hear what this new approach might be. We want to form a special task force, Chris continued. A small group of volunteers who will work closely with Ranger Mitchell and her team. Our goal will be to study Gus's behavior, to try and understand why he's acting the way he is. And based on what we learn, we'll develop a plan to deal with him that doesn't involve hunting or other extreme measures. The room erupted in a cacophony of voices. Some people were nodding in agreement while others shook their heads in disbelief. You want us to study the bear? Mike Harding's voice rose above the din. While it's out there threatening our families, our livelihoods? We're not suggesting we do nothing in the meantime, Ranger Mitchell interjected. We'll be increasing patrols, setting up more warning systems. But yes, we need to understand what's driving Gus's behavior if we're going to find a long-term solution. Sarah stood up, turning to face the crowd. I know this sounds crazy, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I was terrified when we encountered Gus, but there was something different about him, something almost deliberate in the way he acted. If we rush in guns blazing, we might miss an opportunity to learn something important, something that could help us coexist with all the wildlife around us, not just Gus. A thoughtful silence fell over the room. Chris could see people mulling over Sarah's words, the anger on some faces giving way to curiosity. Earl Hawkins cleared his throat from his seat near the front. Folks, he said, his gravelly voice carrying easily through the hall, I've lived here longer than most of you have been alive. I've seen bears come and go, but I've never seen anything quite like Gus. Maybe it's time we considered that there might be more to this story than we understand. Chris nodded gratefully at Earl before addressing the crowd again. I know what we're proposing isn't easy. It's not a quick fix. But I believe it's our best chance at finding a solution that works for everyone, our community and the wildlife we share this land with. He paused, looking out over the faces of his neighbors and friends. So I'm asking for volunteers, people willing to join this task force, to go out there and help us understand what's really going on with Gus. It won't be without risk, but I believe it's necessary. Who's with us? For a long moment, no one moved. Chris felt his heart sink, wondering if they'd misjudged the situation entirely. Then, slowly, hands began to rise. First one, then another, then several more. Chris felt a surge of relief and gratitude as he saw familiar faces volunteering, people he'd known his whole life, ready to face this challenge alongside him. As the meeting broke up, people clustered in small groups discussing the proposal. Chris, Sarah, and Ranger Mitchell found themselves surrounded by those who had volunteered, eager to know more about what they'd be doing. We'll have a more detailed briefing tomorrow, Ranger Mitchell explained. For now, go home. Talk it over with your families. Make sure you understand what you're signing up for. As the crowd thinned out, Mike Harding approached Chris. His face was still set in a scowl, but there was a hint of something else in his eyes. Respect, maybe, or at least a willingness to listen. I still think you're crazy, Mike said gruffly, but I appreciate that you're trying to find a solution that doesn't involve killing the bear outright. Just don't take too long with your studying. We've got livelihoods to protect. Chris nodded, extending his hand. I understand, Mike. We'll work as quickly as we can, and in the meantime, we'll make sure everyone has the resources they need to protect their property and livestock. As Mike shook his hand and walked away, Sarah came up beside Chris, slipping her arm around his waist. That went better than I expected, she said softly. Chris let out a long breath, feeling the tension of the evening finally start to ease. It's a start, he agreed, but we've got a long road ahead of us. They walked out of the community hall together, into the cool night air. The stars were out in force, a glittering canopy stretching from horizon to horizon. Somewhere out there under those same stars, Gus was roaming. But for the first time since this all began, Chris felt a glimmer of hope. They were no longer simply reacting to the bear's presence. They were taking proactive steps to understand, to learn, to find a way forward that respected both the needs of their community and the wild nature of the land they called home. As they drove back to the ranch, Chris and Sarah discussed the plans for the task force, the risks they'd be taking, the unknown challenges that lay ahead. But underlying it all was a sense of purpose, a feeling that they were on the right path. Whatever Gus represented, be it a simple animal pushed to unusual behavior by changing circumstances or something more complex that they had yet to understand, they would face it together. And in doing so, they might just forge a new relationship with the wild heart of Montana, one that could serve as an example for communities everywhere grappling with the challenge of coexisting with nature in all its untamed glory. The early morning mist clung to the ground as Chris Walker led the small group through the dense Montana forest. Behind him, Sarah, Ranger Mitchell, and 3 other volunteers from the community moved quietly, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of Gus. It had been 2 weeks since the formation of the task force, and this was their most ambitious expedition yet. Remember, Chris whispered over his shoulder, we're here to observe, not engage. If we spot Gus, we maintain our distance and document everything we can. Sarah nodded, her hand resting on the canister of bear spray at her hip. And if he spots us first, then we fall back on our training, Ranger Mitchell interjected softly. Stay calm, make ourselves known, and retreat slowly if necessary. The group moved deeper into the woods, following a trail of broken branches and distinctive paw prints that their tracking expert Tom had identified earlier that morning. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, punctuated occasionally by bird calls and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. After about an hour of careful progress, Tom held up a hand, signaling the group to stop. He crouched, down examining something on the forest floor. Fresh scat, he murmured, pointing to a pile nearby. And these tracks, they're recent, within the last few hours, I'd say. Chris felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension course through him. They were close, closer than they'd ever been before. He exchanged a glance with Sarah, seeing his own emotions mirrored in her eyes. Ranger Mitchell stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. All right, folks, this is it. We'll set up our observation point here. Remember, absolute silence from this point on. Use the hand signals we practiced. The group spread out, finding positions behind trees and large rocks that offered both cover and a good view of the surrounding area. Chris and Sarah settled behind a fallen log, their cameras and notepads at the ready. Minutes ticked by, stretching into an hour, then 2. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if aware of the tension among the human intruders. Chris was just beginning to wonder if they had missed their chance when a low, rumbling growl broke the silence. Every head snapped towards the sound. There, emerging from a thicket about 50 yards away, was Gus. The massive grizzly moved with a deliberate grace that belied his size, his nose twitching as he sampled the air. Chris raised his camera slowly, his heart pounding so loud he was sure the bear must be able to hear it. Through the lens, he could see every detail of Gus's fur, the scars on his muzzle, the intelligent gleam in his small, dark eyes. For several minutes, Gus seemed unaware of their presence. He ambled through the clearing, pausing occasionally to investigate a log or root with his powerful claws. The task force members remained frozen, barely daring to breathe as they documented every movement. Then, suddenly, Gus's head swung towards their position. His nostrils flared, and a low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. Chris felt Sarah tense beside him, her hand inching towards her bear spray. "Easy," he breathed, so softly, he wasn't sure she could hear him. "Don't move." Gus took a step towards them, then another. He rose up on his hind legs, towering over the underbrush. From this position, his eyes seemed to lock directly onto Chris's. In that moment, something extraordinary happened. Instead of the blind aggression or simple animal curiosity Chris had expected, he saw something else in Gus's gaze. There was an intelligence there, a sense of recognition, evaluation. It was as if the bear was not just seeing them, but considering them. The moment stretched, seeming to last an eternity. Then, with a huff that sounded almost like resignation, Gus dropped back to all fours. He gave the group one last look, then turned and lumbered back into the forest, disappearing as quietly as he had arrived. For several long minutes, no one moved. Then, Ranger Mitchell's voice broke the silence. "Is everyone all right?" A series of shaky affirmatives sounded from around the clearing. Chris lowered his camera, realizing his hands were trembling. Did you see that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. Chris nodded, unable to find words for what he had just experienced. The others gathered around, their faces a mix of awe and confusion. "I've never seen anything like it," Tom said, shaking his head. "The way he looked at us, it was like he knew exactly who we were and why we were here." Ranger Mitchell's brow was furrowed in thought. "We need to get back and review all our footage and notes. There's something going on here that goes beyond normal bear behavior." As they made their way back to their base camp, the group was uncharacteristically quiet, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed. Chris found himself replaying the moment of eye contact with Gus over and over in his mind. There had been something there, something he couldn't quite explain, but that had shaken him to his core. Back at the camp, they gathered around a table, spreading out their notes and reviewing the footage they had captured. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a series of photos. "See how he's moving? It's not random. He's patrolling, like he's guarding his territory." Tom nodded, adding, "And these markings we've been seeing on the trees, they're not just regular bear scratches. They're too consistent, too deliberate." Ranger Mitchell leaned back, a look of wonder on her face. "It's like he's communicating, leaving messages for us or for other animals. Or both," Chris said quietly. The others turned to look at him. "Think about it. Everything we've seen, the repeated encounters in specific areas, the way he seems to be herding us away from certain parts of the forest, these markings. What if Gus is trying to tell us something?" A heavy silence fell over the group as they considered this possibility. It was a radical idea, one that flew in the face of conventional understanding of bear behavior. And yet, after what they had seen today, it didn't seem entirely impossible. "So, what do we do now?" one of the volunteers asked. Chris looked around at the faces of his teammates, seeing his own mix of excitement and trepidation reflected back at him. "We keep going," he said firmly. "We keep observing, keep documenting. But we also start looking at this from a new angle, not just as a bear to be managed, but as a sentinel of the forest. A guardian, maybe." Sarah reached out and squeezed his hand. "It sounds crazy when you say it out loud," she said with a small smile. "But after what we saw today, I think you might be right." Ranger Mitchell nodded slowly. "It's going to be a hard sell to the higher-ups and to the community, but I agree. There's something special going on here, and we have a responsibility to understand it." As the group continued to discuss their findings and plan their next steps, Chris felt a sense of purpose settling over him. They were on the cusp of something profound, something that could change not just their community's relationship with Gus, but with the entire ecosystem they were a part of. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with potential danger and skepticism from those who hadn't seen what they had seen. But as Chris looked around at his determined teammates, at Sarah's unwavering support, he knew they were equal to the challenge. Whatever Gus was, be it an unusually intelligent bear or something more mysterious, they would find a way to coexist, to learn from him, and perhaps in doing so to forge a new understanding of their place in the wild world around them. The sun was setting over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple as Chris Walker stood on the porch of his ranch house. His eyes scanned the tree line, a habit he'd developed over the past few months. But this time there was no tension in his posture, no fear in his gaze. Instead, there was a sense of calm acceptance, even reverence. Sarah joined him, rapping, an arm around his waist. "Thinking about Gus?" she asked softly. Chris nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Hard not to. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?" Their minds drifted back to the events of the past week. The task force's findings had initially been met with skepticism from both the authorities and the local community. The idea that Gus was more than just a problem bear, that he might be actively trying to communicate something, was a hard sell. But as they presented their evidence, the carefully mapped patterns of Gus's movements, the consistent markings left on trees, the footage of his almost human-like behavior, people began to listen. It helped that there hadn't been any aggressive encounters with Gus since the task force began its work. "Do you think they'll really go through with the sanctuary idea?" Sarah asked, referring to the proposal they'd put forward. Chris nodded slowly. "I think so." Ranger Mitchell seemed optimistic after her meeting with the state wildlife officials. "It's not often you get a chance to study an animal like Gus up close in his natural habitat. The scientific community is intrigued, to say the least." The proposal was to establish a protected area around Gus's territory, a place where he could roam freely while researchers could observe and learn from him. It was a far cry from the calls for hunting parties that had dominated conversations just a few months ago. Their reflections were interrupted by the sound of a vehicle coming up the driveway. It was Ranger Mitchell's truck, with Earl Hawkins in the passenger seat. "Evening, folks," Earl called out as he climbed down from the truck. "Thought we'd stop by and share the good news in person." Ranger Mitchell joined them on the porch, her face wreathed in smiles. "It's official," she announced. "The sanctuary proposal has been approved. We'll start setting up the boundaries next week." A wave of relief and excitement washed over Chris and Sarah. It felt like the culmination of everything they'd been working towards. "That's fantastic news," Chris said, shaking Ranger Mitchell's hand enthusiastically. "But how did you convince them? Last I heard, there was still a lot of pushback from some of the higher-ups." Ranger Mitchell chuckled. "Well, it seems our friend Gus decided to give us one last bit of help. Come on, I'll show you." They all piled into the ranger's truck and drove out to a spot near where they'd had their closest encounter with Gus. As they approached, Chris could see a small group of people gathered around something. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, peering out the window. "You'll see," Earl said cryptically. As they got out of the truck and approached the group, Chris realized they were all staring at a tree. But not just any tree. This one was covered in claw marks, but unlike anything he'd seen before. "Are those—" Sarah began, her voice trailing off in disbelief. "Symbols," Ranger Mitchell confirmed. "Or at least, that's what the experts are saying." "Look closely." Chris stepped forward, examining the marks. They were indeed unlike typical bear scratches. There was a pattern to them, a deliberateness that sent a shiver down his spine. He could make out what looked like crude representations of mountains, trees, and even what might have been meant to be human figures. "It's like he's telling a story," Chris murmured, awe evident in his voice. Earl nodded, his weathered face solemn. "Reminds me of those old stories I told you about. The spirit bears, the guardians of the land. Maybe there was more truth to those tales than we ever realized." One of the researchers on site, a wildlife biologist named Dr. Chen, approached them. "This is unprecedented," she said, her voice brimming with excitement. "We've never seen anything like this level of potential communication from a bear. It's going to revolutionize our understanding of animal intelligence." As the group discussed the implications of this discovery, Chris found his gaze drawn to the forest beyond. For a moment he thought he saw a flicker of movement, a flash of brown fur between the trees, but when he blinked, it was gone. "You saw him, didn't you?" Sarah whispered, squeezing his hand. Chris nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. "I think he was saying goodbye, or maybe just see you around." As they drove back to the ranch later that evening, Chris reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. From fear and confrontation to understanding and coexistence, it had been a transformative experience, not just for him and Sarah, but for the entire community. "You know," he said as they pulled up to the house, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful for Gus, For everything that's happened. Sarah nodded in agreement. It's changed us, hasn't it? Changed how we see our place here. They stood on the porch once more, looking out at the land that had been their home for so long. But now they saw it with new eyes. The forest wasn't just a backdrop or a resource to be managed. It was a living, breathing entity, full of mysteries and intelligence they were only beginning to understand. "So what now?" Sarah asked, leaning her head on Chris's shoulder. Chris took a deep breath, savoring the crisp mountain air. "Now, we keep learning. We be better neighbors, better stewards of this land, and we never forget the lesson Gus taught us, that there's more to this world than we ever imagined." As if in response to his words, a distant roar echoed from the mountains. Chris and Sarah exchanged a smile. It wasn't a sound that brought fear anymore, but a reminder of the wild heart that beat in the land around them. They went inside, leaving the porch light on, a small gesture of welcome to the night and all its inhabitants. The saga of Gus the Grizzly had come to an end, but in many ways Chris knew it was just the beginning. A new chapter was opening, not just for them, but for all who called this wild, beautiful place home. As they settled in for the night, Chris felt a profound sense of gratitude. For Sarah, for their community, for the land itself, and yes, even for Gus, the bear who had changed everything. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them with a new understanding and respect for the delicate balance of the world around them. In the distance, under the vast Montana sky, a lone bear ambled through the forest, leaving behind marks that would puzzle and inspire generations to come. The story of Gus, the grizzly who brought a community together and changed their relationship with the wild, was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning.